All right, looks like we are live. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donnie, and I am your host for this important program on Polystrate fossils. It is a privilege to have John Mackay, the creation guy, and Joseph Hubbard here with me from the creation research team. This isn't their first time, of course. They've been here over a dozen times in the past. You can find the playlist to all of their videos, presentations, and so on with us here at Standing for Truth in the description box of this video. John Mackay and Indiana Joe, thank you so much for being here. And let me hand it over to you, John.
Thanks, Donnie. Just some sort of intro before we get stuck into fossils, and then I'll introduce Joe a little later. Today's program comes from really long decades of research all around the globe. And we did produce a brochure many years ago. It's no longer available as a brochure, but if you want to download it, it's filed on our website, creationresearch.net, and you can actually get a free copy there. And quite a few of the pictures you'll see today are actually out of that brochure. So we not only have been doing it for a long time, we've been keeping photographic records for a long time. And as I've said to my grandson, he said, can I go and get all of your slides? You know, Kodak, remember Kodak slides? They've got a guaranteed lifespan of 50 years. Well, some of mine are nearly due to be expired. So he wants to go and get them all digitized. Unfortunately, it's not the cheapest process in the world to do. But we've got photographic records for 50 years of research there, and you'll see quite a few decades of research this evening. And don't forget, creation, the evidence from polystrate fossils is sort of the first level that we actually did this, and that's available free as a download from our website, creationresearch.net. A bit more recently, we turned into the videos, now available as MP3s and as streaming from creationresearch.net. So if you want to see a more recent version of this, then go to Darwin in the Rocks, produced for Darwin's anniversary a little while ago now, but made a big impact, and part 2 of that on Time's Up Darwin. So if you want to get the streaming, you want to get MP4s or whatever, they are available as well from creationresearch.net. Now, if you were to come to my house this morning, you'll notice my poor darling wife has been blessed abundantly with fossils. Fossils everywhere, all over the yards. And Joe's been here, he'll tell you that. But of course, we don't just use them for making rock gardens or anything like that. Some of them you've seen and we've used on programs because we major in not only polystrate fossils, but in catastrophic fossils. You see that nice team of trilobites following one another, crashing into one another with what looks like a fish impression at the top there? Well, these are polystrate because they stick out of the rock. But of course, that doesn't make sense to most people, but it's definitely and provably catastrophic, beautifully preserved, and well enabled you to see exactly what they are. Now, that's the normal sort of fossils that we deal with, but strewn around the yard are other fossils that relate to tonight's topic. How do you like our Jurassic fossils? Oh, a special Jurassic fossil, because up the top is our Wollemi cousin. You know, our most famous living fossil, the Wollemi pine, that was found living just outside of Sydney and now is sort of internationally famous, and you can buy a specimen and grow it. Joe's got a couple for his museum coming up because a lady in England found out how to make copies of them. Yep, she's actually done a great job at breeding Wollemi fossils. But it's not just the fossil trees that are of interest. Can you actually, I'll get it there. Can you see just under the bit of sticky tape there, there's a fish, a couple of fish down near this finger here. Now, both of these, the tree and the fishes, are living fossils. The Wollemi pine has now been found to be here, and the fishes at the bottom are actually Murray River herrings. They are still around. So there we have a fossil leaf presentation from pine trees mixed with fossil fishes. But what's interesting about the Wollemi pine is we know it doesn't like its feet in the water. So there we have plants mixed in with very catastrophically buried fishes, because they're buried whole, they're buried fast, they're jumbled up together, they are catastrophically buried, along with land plants that are brought in and buried. Okay, but tonight's topic goes a little further. You see, if you come to my yard, you will notice why my wife is so privileged, because I have a huge collection of trees, polystrate trees, usually pine trees. Some of these are from Jurassic Ark, our outdoor museum. So go to creationresearch.net, click on Jurassic Ark, and we have one spectacular polystrate. You will see it tonight or today, whatever time in the world you are, regardless of how many prime ministers England is currently turning over in 6 or 7 weeks. So we have polystrate trees. Polystrate, well, poly as in many, poly as in polyunsaturated. It's just a word that means many. Poly, you can link all these molecules together and get long molecules of plastics and things like that. Poly just means many. Now, I was asked by Donnie beforehand, is it polystrata or polystrate? They both work. Polystrata means through many strata, and it's easier to say polystrate because you don't have to say the last A. The English might like adding the extra sounds onto it, but in Australia, just polystrate will do. And that's the one that's entering into the literature finally, because you'll find out that you can't really do much research in the literature on polystrate fossils because they've been refusedly not acknowledged anywhere. Oh, and one of the things we've done, if I just hold this tree up there, right, this one is from our Jurassic deposits here. Notice I've sliced it in 3 places, because one of the things we've done is, I'll hold it a bit closer. One of the things we've done is cut these open to actually study the tree rings that are inside them and polish them. We use that to identify them so that these are pine trees. And as we notice in all Australian pine trees or Oricaria, southern conifers, in Australia, they live in the dry. They do not like their feet wet. They can't cope with wet ground. They will die out. So they're sort of not too dry. They don't sort of like our desert, but neither do they like our swamps. They're not like some of your swamps, Florida cypress or anything like that. So usually what we've done with polystrates is look at them, study them, find where they are, look up any historic records or comments by experts, which there are very few out there brave enough to talk about these subjects, and then do our own research over decades. So Donnie, if you want to switch up the PowerPoint, that would be great. Okay,
absolutely.
So
that's good.
Yep, there we are. You'll see our old logo there and a reminder about the Genesis Museum of Creation Research. So when Joe joins us full screen a little later, be grateful. He's been working flat out on the current version of the museum in England. Great report he'll bring. But look up anything on creationresearch.net and just keep watching what's happening there. Okay, let's try here. All right. Why aren't we going anywhere? All right, George, we're not going anywhere. Why aren't we?
I think you might.
The fossil guy. Why aren't we moving?
I think you might just need to click the slide.
There we are. We've done it. We've done it. That's good. Okay, so here we have a map of the world. There you will see, courtesy of Google, a map of Australia down the bottom. And we're going to start on the east coast there, because many years ago, I got to go to this place. Dr. Andrew Snelling was with me, and we were actually looking at some of the first polystrate trees recognized as fossil trees, but no comment usually by the experts. Oh, so Edgeworth David, can you actually spot the trees there? So Edgeworth David was brave enough to go on record about these trees in the pilot scene. Can you spot them? I'll outline them. Pine trees. Okay, now I've spoken about these pine trees. You can't go and see them anymore because the real estate people divided up the whole old coal mine. The government sort of allocated some of it to general tourism sort of thing. But these are pine trees, and there's 10 meters, 30 feet between the top pilot seam and the lower pilot seam. I've given papers on this. to the Sydney Basin Coal Conference, and you'll see there a presentation with a schematic diagram of what's actually present. And David Edgeworth said that these trees are pine trees for sure, but he made an interesting comment. Around the bottom of them, they have no pine debris. So he reached the conclusion that these trees were washed in from somewhere to the northwest, and all of this was deposited around them. They're not just a forest that's being buried, they were a forest somewhere else. And then it's catastrophically buried in waterborne volcanic ash. Now, at the same time, at one of the presentations, I said the early explorers, the early coal miners, the early professor of Newcastle University made the comment that these trees went from one coal seam and up through a second one. Now, the funny thing was that was totally rejected by the conference. So my colleague and I, there's Jeff Smith, we went and we dug out a full one. Now, can you see the black layers there? If you think of each black layer as a strata, which is what it is, then you'll notice that our coalified pine tree, it's coal on the outside anyway, is actually going through multiple coal seams. So it's not just the upper and lower pilot seams that this coal tree goes to, it's many, many, many layers of coal in the volcanic strata. Okay, go one step further. Here's a more famous tree that I found, and now sadly that cliff has washed away. But when you get up close, you will notice it's a broken tree. It's coal black on the outside, and it's an iron red color on the inside. Okay, but there's a snap in it. This tree has been broken, something catastrophic happened, and then it's been dumped and buried with the break still preserved. Okay, there's me a few years later, and I'm standing beside a polystrate pine tree, black on the outside, reddish on the inside. Now you will see it goes through layers of grey stuff, layers of yellowish sandstone. So it's sitting in sort of shaly rocks, proceeding up into sandstone. And these are some of the areas I've studied immensely in Australia. In fact, we've taken many visitors to these, as we have done around the world. Now, the second lot of trees I got to see were in Nova Scotia. I went there because I'd read about them. Joggins, Nova Scotia is actually in the literature from the days of Charles Lyell. So I wanted to go and check what the trees were. And in association with the professor of geology from the nearby university, we did a really interesting study. Okay, Nova Scotia, Canada, no roots, no branches. There's no reason to conclude it grew there, because trees without roots don't grow anywhere. And I followed this array of trees all the way down to Alabama, USA. Now, how did I know about this one? No, it's not in the literature, but I've learned one thing. Newcastle in Australia is called Newcastle for a totally different reason than Newcastle in England is called Newcastle. As Newcastle in Alabama is called Newcastle. Or Newcastle in England is called that because the old castle burnt down in about 1100. So they built a new castle, or castle, as some people say. But I've learned that they called Newcastle in Australia after the coal found in Newcastle, England. And so when I saw Newcastle, Alabama, which isn't much in the literature, I went there. It had to have coal. And sure enough, it did. And being an Aussie has some advantages. I got approval to go and do a study. And okay, here's me with one of the local residents there, and we're looking at a polystrate tree. See it standing upright? The top's missing, no roots on the bottom, but what you find is the outside is coal. Now, these are trees of an interesting sort. They're hollow trees, but the outside is almost invariably coal and the inside is something else. And that's what kicked off this program. Can you call these things trees? Well, the answer is yes. They're not actually solid trees. They're hollow trees filled up with something really interesting. But we'll get to that. The outside is coal. Keep that in mind. And following all of these trees down through Alabama, you will find that the Pennsylvanian rocks, which are carboniferous in the UK, they're at all levels. They are under us, they were beside us, and they were above us. And you can see there the tree hanging down from the Carboniferous, or Pennsylvanian as the Americans prefer to call it, and there's no visible root system attached. Now, that's one reason, by the way, that these have been so dangerous. These trees are sort of slanting on the edges, so they sort of are like a pencil point, and very often miners have been squashed flat when these things just slip out of the coal seam. Not held by roots, not held by anything. They are called kettle bottoms, and you don't want to be hit on the head by a kettle. Okay, going from there across to England, having lectured in coal geology and having presented papers, it was fairly interesting that I had no trouble accessing the coal mines in England. It was great to notice that one of my colleagues was the head of the coal board, and he just made arrangements as easy as one thing. So I'm always grateful to him. So England, here we have, look, polystrate trees. Now, if you've got a good visual memory, you will have noticed that the trees so far, except for the ones at Newcastle, all look the same. The ones in Newcastle, the ones in England at Newcastle are not the same. This is one of those hollow trees. They're giant reeds. Today, many of these are still here, but they're tiny. But you get up to these, and they're always referred to, if you know your stuff, the locals say, look, it goes through many layers. Now, did that tree stand there and get buried slowly? Well, as a hollow tree, what's interesting, of course, they become famous because of they actually featured in National Geographic. Near Cookeville, Tennessee, is the address National Geographic gives. Not accurate at all. Took us 10 years to track these down, and there's no such place as Kettle's coal mines. Not at all, no matter what National Geographic says. I know this because, you see, after tracking this down for years, we visited that tree in 2009. It's still there. See the multiple layers? It's the remains of one of those hollow trees. You can see it slants to the top, it narrows to the top. No wonder they fall out. And in the Tennessee Cookeville area, there were lots of accidents when these trees would slip out. You needed to get a good sense of when to avoid the bottom of these trees. They were very heavy. They squashed you flat. So in one day, we studied tree after tree after tree. There's our 2009 trip. So we've started in the 1980s on these polystrate trees, and we're now 30 years later, and our files are becoming enormous. So to give you a further explanation, is our fossil tree. That's one of the first polystrate trees I found in Tennessee. Now, it wasn't initially found by me. It's been known by many, many people. There's my colleague Bob Powell at the bottom. Now, he and I went and studied one of the best university libraries in the USA, doing a simple search. How many polystrate trees are in the literature in Tennessee? Because by this time, we had found hundreds and hundreds of them. Well, you can see why it's called polystrate. Now, we spent several hours in the university library searching in every which way plus loose, consulting the librarians, and the sum total of our research after several hours in this university library was that they recorded absolutely no polystrate trees in Tennessee. Not just because we'd misused the word, they weren't called polystrate. You do a search for any sort of fossil trees in the coal seams of Tennessee, and they've been blatantly ignored, because the sort of thing you can do with them, well, I remember talking to one geologist, and he basically said, I'm not going to tell you about these trees because I know what you do with them. He's quite right. You have a polystrate, soft-tissued, hollow tree like that, which may go to coal on the outside, and it had to be buried rapidly in order to be preserved. Well, not in the library access system. You come to Australia, where a new sort of tree is actually on our records, one that I don't think is in any library file except ours. We're sort of just north of Brisbane, Australia, just west of our Jurassic Ark fossil site. We're out near, well, so just say west of Bundaberg if you want to get a precise location. Here's John Mackay, the creation guy, and yep, I've still got that hat. It's down in the house, a little dirtier and worn now. But can you see the tree in front of me there? Okay, what's interesting about this tree is it's vertical. It's got a layer of soil at the bottom, so it seems to have grown in place beyond a shadow of a doubt, but in reality, it's covered with diatomaceous earth. You know, the microscopic little creatures. The tree is wood, it's solid, it's not one of those equisetums at all. It's not a lepidodendron, it's a solid Aussie tree standing upright, and neither is it turned to coal. It's still wood. Okay, swap from there to UK, and Joseph will talk at length about this later. But when I first went looking for this tree, I've shared many times that what we've got is an area just outside of Manchester. I mean, I raided all the geological literature around Manchester and in the British Museum when they used to supply all the geological surveys. You can't quite get many of them anymore because they're sort of out of print. So our library of geology records is incredible. Now we're on the moors near Manchester, and we're really opposite Newcastle. Now the whole coal seam business, I tell you this because you can follow it from Manchester and you can find it on the other side of England at Newcastle. Now, what were we looking for? The answer was that. Now that was on the back of the book Geology of Manchester, an official publication. Now, do you see the tree that's there? Now, this tree had gotten lost, so I went looking for it, and Joe will show you the results. We did find it. So not only have we dug up in Australia, in Joggins, in Alabama, Newcastle in England, but now outside of Manchester, we found a missing tree. Does it still look like that? Well, Joe's got that section tonight, so let's jump immediately to Alaska. Yes, in the days when you could fly freely pre-COVID, I used to score miles and miles of air mile points, and going to Alaska was included in them, and running field trips. Now, I didn't do it in winter because that's what Alaska looks like in winter. I know that because I drove my ski mobile up through those trees, and then I made one mistake only an Australian would make. I stopped the snowmobile and I got off and immediately disappeared in 6 feet of snow. I thought the snowmobile was on solid ground, but it wasn't. It was on a huge drift of snow. But in the summer, when I was leading field trips, can you see the polystrates up above? These are solid trees. They have solid contents. They're not the reed type trees at all. And some of them were enormous. Yes, you heard me, that's summer. Look, I'm dressed up with a warm hat and warm jacket and warm trousers, insulated underwear. For an Australian, to me, this was cold. For the Alaskans, well, they still had their jackets on, and we began to dig. Yes, it's kept me moderately healthy in my middle old age, all this climbing up cliffs to dig down fossil trees and see what's there. Of course, I then ended up near Leith in Edinburgh, not far from where my dad was born. And we are there investigating this tree. Now, that tree is currently in the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens. And of course, we've used it many times, both at Jurassic Ark as well as in our coal studies to touch the topics of creation, the flood. And tonight, I'm not really going to deal much with the flood. My finishing point should catch you by surprise because it's something that was brought to my attention by Professor Derek Ager, who's one of my geological heroes, even though he despises creationists. He's one of the few people who actually deals with what's there, not the theory. So we're going to finish tonight with time in the rocks. Meanwhile, back to Australia, back to Jurassic Ark. When you come to Australia, which you can now do, you don't need immunisation or anything to get on a plane to Australia now. You need to get back to America, though. That's if you're not a local. But come to Australia, visit Jurassic Ark, and you'll see some of our fossil trees used in the world's only petrified tree sundial. It's really worth coming. But why have we got our petrified tree up there? Because when we first started digging, here's our geologist Liam Frymere explaining to a press guy all about what we've just found. There's the strata label for you to see, and you'll see at right angles there's a polystrate tree. It actually sits at right angles to the strata, and it's a solid pine tree turned to stone. Now, when people think of fossil trees, this is what they normally think of. Hence the original comment, well, if there's nothing inside these hollow trees standing up in Tennessee and Alabama and England, then they can't be trees. Well, they are officially recognized as trees. They're just giant versions of some of our lepidodendron type fossils that are still here today, that are nowhere near as thick as my finger usually, and usually only a third of a meter tall. If you come to Jurassic Ark, you'll see we have a lovely big mural, and my thanks to the many artists around the world who are quite regular watchers of our creation conversations, which, by the way, sneaking a commercial, is this Saturday Australia time at 8 o'clock, but English time 9 o'clock the previous night on the Friday. You will see we discuss these and we mention our murals. Well, here's a set of murals with the fossil tree we just talked about in the top left-hand side, the fossil tree in the middle that is from Edinburgh, the fossil tree on the right-hand side I haven't got to yet, and yours truly looking at that lost tree and refining it. And they give rise to questions like that. Did these trees live here? How do you explain it if they don't have roots? Did they just die here? Were they living and died and buried? Were they just buried there? Was the burial fast or slow? What types are there? What's around them? What's in them? Now, I'm going to skip straight up to this one. What's around them? Because most people, let's be honest, if they dig up a dinosaur, all they want is the skeleton. Very few people will take the years needed to actually pick up every rock, to actually excavate the leaves around them, to actually check what's in their stomach, to actually go a quarter of a mile away and see what's that fossil tree standing upright beside a dinosaur. What's it tell you? Well, I spent years, along with my colleagues Bob Powell and the other folks in Tennessee, excavating what's around them. So let's go to Tennessee, USA. And by the way, if you go there, they do kind of speak English. You just have to get your ears used to some of their prolonged vowels, and the Texans are even longer than that. Here's Bob Powell, worked for the Department of Geology in Tennessee for many years and is retired now, but we're in a coal mine. Can you see that tree standing upright? Yes, there's been some cave-ins in this mine. You'll see a big one on his front and another one on the left, going up through many layers, polystrate. Now, what's interesting about these trees is they are always coal on the outside, no matter what's on the inside. But that's what our program's designed to tell us. What's in that grey stuff inside the coalified, bark, if you want to call it that. Okay, there's me on the outside of that coal strip. Yep, many years ago now, but we've kept all the files and studied them. And we are, by the way, one of the few groups on the planet who's done this. And I would say we're the only group on the planet who's got tens of thousands of fossil tree pictures and fossil tree data, as well as the fossils that go with them. So there you'll see the tree that's fallen out. You can see the inside of the tree, hence we can be authoritative as to what's in them. You'll see a coal seam on the bottom. And yeah, you're quite right. This was a coal mining area, but look at that puny coal seam, maybe 2 foot thick. I amazed some of the people in Tennessee and in England when I said, hey, listen, I can tell you why you're losing out to Australia. We've got coal seams that are 100 meters thick. Yeah, quite unbelievable. It makes our coal so cheap to dig out, no matter how unpopular it is today. It will continue to be a source of energy. And you'll notice that some people have currently redefined it as just preserved leaves, so it's green energy. Very clever. We've collected the stuff that's in the coal. We've collected what's above the coal. So we know how to set up an experiment to actually make it artificially. So coal can be manufactured artificially. At the moment, it's still more expensive than digging it up. But at that level above the coal seam, look what we found. Look at that beautiful fossil. Yes, fully excavated and cleaned up by yours truly. Isn't that a beautiful fossil? I mean, the coal's supposed to be a swamp. Tassel ferns today are still here. Some of them in the past were just as small as they are today. Some of them were much bigger. But either way, they're easy to recognize. And look at some of the ferns we've excavated. Now, we just had to pull that out. It came out cleanly and it's magnificent. We can tell it's a fern, although some of the ferns in this deposit are of the seed fern variety. Today, we have just sporified ferns, and they're in the rocks too here, but you also find ferns that used to have seeds and they seem to have died out. Okay, so we have land plants in the area between the base of that tree and the top of the coal seam. But over the years, we've found very interesting fossils within the top 10 centimeters, within the top 4 inches of the coal seam. Look at the first set of fossil footprints we got out of there. We've since learned how to follow them and where to expect them next. But of course, in this layer, you will not only enjoy finding fossil footprints, there's an American coin for scale, 10-cent coin, and look, just beautiful tops and bottoms. Now, for those of you fossil collectors, I have no idea why, but in the market, if you're in the market for these things, and we don't sell these good specimens at all, we keep them for research, you will find that if you have a fossil and you only have one side of it, you will more than double its value if you have both the top and the bottom side. So those of you who are going to Joe's Museum in England or come to our office, yes, we do sell fossils, and you will find the charge jumps up incredibly if you can get both the top and the bottom. But some of these are available. But what they lead to is even more interesting, because one of the things I found is because these footprints are well preserved, then take it from me, the well preserved footprints, it doesn't happen on a beach. The footprints wash away. If you have flood currents washing mud in fast enough to preserve these footprints, then sooner or later, following along the trail, you will find buried animals as well. So let's summarize. We have land plants, and we have amphibian. That's the footprints tend to come from things like frogs. You know, the not the cane toads, but the big thummy frogs. They're water-like creatures, even though they need land. But following the footprints, maybe 30 or 40 feet, 10 meters or so, look what I found. How good are your eyes? No, I didn't find the coin. I put that there for scale, right? Be great, you could go to coal mine and dig up coins, but you can't spot it yet. I'll outline it for you. It's a marine brachiopod. Okay, the coal is 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters below. The frog footprints are sort of 30 feet to the left, and following along here, we have marine brachiopods. Yep. And what's next? Well, this one was hard to get out, and even harder to keep in one piece and make it to Australia, whereupon I gave it to one of our experts out here, because my thought was this is provably marine and it's very unusual and not really recorded in coal seams, because it turns out to be a horseshoe crab. Yep. We actually went and got the whole thing beautifully cleaned up, and a beautiful bit of research, a beautiful bit of, well, look, let's summarize it all, because if you want to know what's around these trees, we can help you perhaps more than anybody else on the planet. There are land plants, mixed with water creatures, and there are sea creatures. And then there's the coal seam, which is largely land plants and bark. Did you hear what I just said? You rarely find a whole tree turned to bark, because in this area, only the outside of the trees is coalifiable anyway. And in the coal seams, even in Australia, even in our thickest coal seams, it's only the bark that turns to coal. What's happened to the rest of the tree? Well, if you come a bit further along this coal seam, you'll find some beautifully exposed root bases. Again, if you dug a bit more, you'd find it would fall out on you. So there you'll find my tiny little 5-pointer tool. By the way, that's one of the best excavating tools I've ever found use of. It's got nothing to do with geology in the hardware stores, but boy, are they helpful for excavating carefully. You'll notice the base. Now, if you can find any roots there, you're better than any one of us, because if you look at these trees, that one's near Spencer. It's got a root base that slopes out. We have failed to find any complete roots. If you find roots on it, you'll find they terminate and they are broken, whether they're 10 inches, whether they're 50 centimeters, whether they're 3 meters away. Check the end of the roots to see if it grew there. And I'll tell you why a little later. So you'll find these trees standing upright on the coal, but you'll also find them standing way above the coal. Now, there's a polystrate tree. It's no coal. There's no roots. Oh, yes, there's a heavy root base. So, well, fortunately for the miners who dug this coal mine, the coal seam was about 2 meters below it. So this had nothing to do with the coal seam. There's no coal anywhere near it, and no evidence it actually grew there at all. No vegetation, no swamp interpretation is even possible. So when you go a bit further, here's where we are now. We have evidence that this whole area was washed into place. And of course, what you find with the polystrate trees, if the layers are washing in sideways, which is the point we've been making with our strata machine, then don't be surprised that when you measure all of these trees, and yes, we have had surveyors up there, we've had them with their fancy 5-point, you know how today surveying is so much easier. When I started in geology, we had to learn surveying, and we had to do it with the old ball and chain method. I was wrong half the time that I was right. And in reality, now you just get your theodolite and it's keyed into satellites, and you can plot every one of these trees. And better than that, your photographic records can actually record where the bottom is compared to the top. And in this case, there's a definite direction to the layers coming in. They've come in from the right and they're heading towards the left. Sounds a lot like our strata machine. But you see, just immediately, even if you thought they grew there, the presence of sea animals, land creatures, seashells, and land plants tells you you are looking at a rapidly deposited flood area, and you can be dogmatic. Well, being dogmatic doesn't help you too much if you're a university student. Here's one of our early helpers. He was at a geology conference in Tennessee put on by the Geology Association there, hosted by Bob Powell. And he'd heard from his cousin that I was going to be the speaker. And I spoke on Mount St. Helens and fossil trees. And he'd had trouble believing the biblical record as literal truth. Well, I met his wife a few weeks later, who was a homeschooler, and she said, it excited my husband. Bob Stewart is now a convinced creationist, 6-day creationist, and he's a great help to our ministry. Okay, why have I got him shown? It's not just to tell you that. You see, he went to university not far from here. And so I asked him, in all your university days studying to be a geologist, did they ever bring you to these fossil trees? His answer, no. I said, did they ever take you to any fossil trees in Tennessee? No. Now, so far, we've found thousands and thousands of these fossil trees, and I even asked a guy who was doing his master's degree at the same university, you are studying this area? Did they bring you here? Nope. Never mentioned any of these fossil trees at all. But even worse, if I could just bring up a white slide, but George, don't bring me back on yet. That's in a few moments. How does the world deal with this? Well, one of my students was a mining engineer, and when he went back from my geology course to the mine, I asked, can you get me into the mine and get me permission to do a day's study, because I'll guarantee there are trees in your mine? And his answer, no, I've worked here now for ages. There's no fossil trees. So my simple question was, do you know what you're looking for? I haven't thought of that question. So we got permission to go into the mine, and we actually found the trees within 10 minutes. And he said, oh, they're trees. Yes, they were trees, rock solid trees. Now he told his mining superintendent there, and the next day that area of mine which was not being mined was blown to smithereens. Sorry, you can't go and see the evidence. When you have a look at this area here, the one we excavated at New South Wales, where we quoted the original first professor of geology as saying these trees go from one coal seam through the next. I was officially chastised by the head of the geological department at Newcastle University. There are no such trees. Now, because he was at the top and I was fairly close to the bottom, well, I'm sorry, authority counts instead of truth, right? The reality is, don't use authorities as evidence. They rarely are. No such trees? Well, just go down the cliffs. I can still take you to these trees. They're right there. So what else is polystrate? This is my last little section. Then I'm going to bring Joe on and we'll both talk for a little while. But let me take you first of all to the first coal seam ever seen by an Englishman in Australia. That one right there. So yes, we do our check of history. Can I encourage those of you who are watching, don't just take current geologists as authority, because we've told you over and over again, the chief aim of modern geology is based on Charles Lyell, and his aim was to get rid of Moses. Okay, Newcastle, Australia. There's the first coal seam, still there. But very few geologists even go there. It's awkward to get to that place. The guy was sailing along the coast, didn't bother stopping to check it, just recorded it. Okay, can you see the polystrate tree? The many layers? And if you keep digging, it goes down. It used to go up, but the top's washed off by the looks of it. But what's interesting is if you keep going down, you will start seeing some interesting fossils. There's my hammer, there's a layer, and you get close up, and what you can see is a leaf buried vertically. Get you even closer to that. Excavate it. So it's now in our fossil deposit. The leaf is vertical. The layers in that rock, provably, when you turn it around, go horizontally, and the leaf is vertical. Now, we have dozens of such trees we've collected from this site. Now, when you look at the trees are pine trees, but these are not pine leaves. You can tell that. That's why Professor David Edgeworth said there's something wrong here. This is a flood deposit and is continually ignored. If it was a tree, a set of pine tree forest that was buried, you'd have pine tree debris along the base of the coal seams, but you don't. You have these strange non-pine leaves. In fact, when you look at the deposit in America, you not only have the polystrate trees, but you have something else that's interesting. Not just fingers. That's one of my colleagues' fingers for scale. We have many famous fingers in creation research. You can become famous just by being our model there. In fact, some of you may already know that many of the hands that appear on TV for products like gloves and laundry, etc., are actually insured against damage because they pick the best looking hands. Well, we don't. We just have ordinary hands. There's a polystrate fern. You have to look carefully when you're doing geology, because most of these things are missed. It's a fern. Ferns are soft tissue, and it went from one area up through a sandstone layer, up into shale, and that's the one where I showed you before. We excavated that fern, beautifully preserved. Now, since ferns don't last through the summer, once they die, they really rapidly decay in the following winter. We had a hot day here in Australia 2 days ago, and I grow edible fern. You heard me. There are many ferns you can't eat. Well, you can. They won't kill you, but they'll send you to the toilet really fast. My edible fern is a soft fern, and it's beautiful. You can eat it. But 1 day of heat, and it's all black and withered up. Most ferns are like that. Rapidly buried. The evidence. Come to Australia. Here is me again at that uniquely discovered polystrate with a layer of soil underneath it. It definitely looks like there's been an earthquake. The top of the valley has tipped up, the bottom of the valley has tipped down, and there's been a layer, or a lake really, probably formed behind a basalt column that went right across the valley. And where you get basalt flows, if it becomes a lake behind it, because of the minerals in the basalt, you'll very soon find a proliferation of diatoms, microscopic creatures. And it looks like the basalt wall has collapsed, and pouring down through the valley has been a flood of diatomaceous earth, now covering up the trees. Definitely looks like it grew there. Definitely looks like, well, the tree was buried so rapidly, other things were preserved as well. You see, if you can find present day polystrates, compare them to fossil polystrates, you've got a good measure on whether the tree is soft or hard and how quickly it was buried. Okay, look what else was quickly buried. Now, when I first found this, yes, we had to chip it out. It was still green. Yep, it was. Okay, but look what, can you spot? How good are your eyes? It's a polystrate leaf. It was standing vertically. And there's the layers. Now, these layers are all layers of diatomaceous earth, which are poured in from the right and picked up the leaves and carried them with them. So, well, come on, if those layers were all being too different in velocity, coming one after the other, if they were slowly deposited, then the leaf would first of all bend, and then it would rot off at the top before it was covered. So the bottom might be preserved, but unless you have rapid current moving, unless you have the layers all coming in at once, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, those of you who still love Steno, remember, he got a few things wrong. He got a lot right, but man, do you need to rethink his sedimentation theories. Polystrate leaves, that's what's around them. Well, here's one that's probably more known by local geologists. They bother to go there because the university many years ago actually talked to the council. They built a path along there to show a fossil forest. The trouble is, it's not a fossil forest because no roots, no branches, no soil, no differential rotting. You see, you cover up a tree slowly, then the base will be preserved, the roots will be preserved, but the top of the tree will show rotting. The beds are turbulent. The leaf litter is wrong. Even polystrate leaves you've seen in this deposit at Newcastle. Now, that's by way of introduction, because I'll get you to bring me on live again now, Donnie. Joe's going to take over shortly. But Joe, tell us what you're up to. Put me on full screen and bring Joe on as well.
Oh, thank you for that, John. And it's sort of just headed towards midnight here in the UK. So I'm on the coffee, which is grand. And it's been a rather interesting few weeks. And I'll run down through some of the activities that we've been doing. But as well as the normal everyday creation research work, we've also had our first sort of long-term ministry tour through the UK in getting on for 3.5 years now. So the last full-time, long one that we did was when you were last over here, John, back in 2019. So long time ago. So that's been sort of fairly full on, and the Lord has blessed us, and your support has enabled us to do things like get vehicles so we don't have to keep hiring things, which has been wonderful. And we've been traveling around with all of that. On top of that, we've also had a big convention, which I'll show you some pictures of in just a moment. But really, a big part of what we've been doing has been caught up in the building that I'm currently in. Back in sort of June, July time, we ended up acquiring a brand new building for our Creation Research Museums project. Now, over the last sort of many years, both John and myself have been collecting fossils and artifacts and all sorts of cool things. And we've been keeping them in storage and sort of praying about what the Lord would have us do with them. Obviously, put them on display, but where and when and how and all of these kind of questions, well, the Lord has provided above and beyond. And so, well, let me give you a quick little tour around. Just move the camera around so you can see some of these things. Let's see if we can get it. So you can see behind me, we've got a big collection of fossils laid out here. Now, we have an open day coming up on Saturday. That's this Saturday. But we've got living fossils over the back there. Trying to avoid the glare of the lights. We've got dinosaurs over there, marine creatures over there. You can see we've got all the chairs out. We're just getting prepared for an open day, so we've got a load of brand new displays and stuff, and we're going to be doing a big sort of rally, and loads of supporters are coming along. Lots of archaeology. You can see our King Nebuchadnezzar brick just in the back there as well. We're set up for a seminar at the moment, as you can see, but what I'm going to do is quickly pull on Let's get that lined up a bit better. There we go. Let me very quickly pull up a few slides, and we'll run down through a few of the things that we've been doing before diving into this topic, because yes, John has asked me to carry on with a sort of a UK perspective of polystrate trees and things like that. But really, when we're dealing with polystrates, it is just so much more than just the trees. There are some really important other fossils that are polystrate as well. So hopefully you can see that now up on the screen in front of me. You can see we've got the Creation Research Centre Open Day, which is the building that we're in. Now, that's not an opening day, but an open day like we do in most of our museums around the world. It's a time for supporters to be able to come and actually see what we've been doing, see where we've been spending their money, get an idea of the kind of potential of the museum and the building, and get to share some testimonies and so on and so forth. So it's happening on the 29th of October. I would love to say come and book your tickets, but I'm afraid we're fully booked. We really are crammed to the hilt with everybody who's coming, which has been wonderful. But saying that, even though it's not an opening day, you are still able to come and visit the museum over the next few weeks. If you would like to book, just get in touch with us and we'll give you a tour around and show you the sites and what's been going on. But going forward from that, we've got a team that's coming on board to help sustain this, and so we'll be able to have some official opening times coming up early in the new year. So do stay in touch with us. Yes, there's plenty of ways that you can do that. Obviously, the main site is creationresearch.net. You're all familiar with that, but the creationresearchcentre.com is where the museum is based at, and that website is currently undergoing a big revamp and a redo, and loads of new information will be up on there very shortly. There's the building, by the way. We're in Oswestry in the UK. That's sort of on the border of England and Wales. Near the famous town of Shrewsbury, well known as the birthplace of Charles Darwin, and the town knows that, and they promote it big time. So we're in a fairly prime location to discuss this kind of stuff, and it's part of a network of museums that we're developing in association with other churches around the UK, and of course they're all part of the Creation Research family. So whether it's Jurassic Ark in Queensland, whether it's the Creation Discovery Centre in Tasmania, and so on and so forth. These are all part of the Creation Research Museums. And one thing that we promote, and one thing we make sure that everybody who comes through the doors, Christian or not, understands at the end of it, is that all things were made by Jesus Christ. You see, the Bible is emphatic in both the Old and the New Testaments that it is Jesus Christ who is the creator. So find out more about the Creation Research Centre, support the UK Museum Ministry, sign up to the UK newsletter no matter where you are around the world. It keeps you updated with what we're doing and what's been going on. But here's some of the fabulous fossils inside the museum. Now, we've actually got one of our trustees in the UK coming over to give us a hand, and he lived in Germany for many years, and he brought us a big parcel, and he said, last time John Mackay was out here, he left this big box. It was all sealed up and packaged up. He said, I wonder what's inside of it. Well, most of it were the sort of, the boring books and DVDs and the odd bit of clothes and tools. But eventually we dug down and found this rather spectacular fossil at the bottom. So yes, I'm sorry, John, I've pinched it. You're not getting this back now. This is here in the UK Museum. You can see what it is. You've actually got a southern conifer. Now, these are part of the Araucaria family. They're still alive today. They're living fossils. They grow in Australia. And on the right-hand side, you can see the fossil ammonite, the curly-whirly ammonite. As far as you know, these shelled cephalopods are now extinct. Where is this from, though? Well, Germany, the Jurassic Jura. Yeah, because you'll find that Jurassic is actually named after the Jura Mountains, which are in Germany. This is part of the Solnhofen or the Mulheim, which is in Germany, this wonderful limestoney kind of rock, and it's full of fabulous fossils, including squid, including ammonites, and plants. And the point that we like to make is whenever you find plants and sea creatures buried together, deep sea creatures as well, you have excellent evidence of a flooding event. In fact, just behind me over here, we have an entire setup table of flood evidence rocks, creatures which are buried together, which just simply don't belong together. We've got our giant fossils up on the wall as well, our great big Orthoceras and our crinoids from Morocco, beautiful sea lilies, living fossils and excellent evidence of flowing water in the Orthoceras. And this is a rather spectacular fossil, which was actually donated to us by a church, believe it or not, who actually had it given to them by a quarry man, or somebody who works in stones and masonry and stuff. You see the footprint up the top there? Yeah, this is one of the best preserved that we've ever come across. And as far as we can find, there's only 2 other examples in the world from this deposit. It's part of the Purbeck limestone, and it's actually a pterodactyl footprint. You know, the big flying reptiles, often referred to as flying dinosaurs? Well, we're really blessed to have some really world-class museum fossils here, which we've managed to get up onto the walls nicely mounted thanks to some wonderful supporters who've worked out a brilliant technique for mounting these rather heavy fossils up on the wall. So we've been busy at work getting the museum ready over the past week or so. And there's our giant T-Rex head as well. So great fun, not just the fossils. So yes, a reminder, support the UK Museum Ministry, get behind us, because this is the other kind of stuff that we do and what the Museum Ministry facilitates. This was recently taken at one of our large conventions. It's the first time we've tried a big camping convention, 6 days down in Dorset, down on the beach every day digging up fossils, workshops in the afternoon, seminars in the evening. And here is Simon Turpin from Answers in Genesis, who's actually giving us a really excellent talk on scoffers, the scoffers that God had promised in Peter would come in the last days, and the implications for today as well. What did we do down there? Well, it was all based around going down to the rocks and actually seeing what the evidence said itself. Here's Dr. Diane Eager, who's here with us in the UK at the moment, one of our researchers, medical biology background, and she's also looking at another fossil. Actually, this is a fossil Araucaria, another southern pine fossil, just like the ones over in Germany and the ones that are growing alive today in Australia. Diane knows, she's from Australia. And what has she found? Well, on the right-hand side, you've got a great big fossil log. On the left-hand side, you've actually got another one of those curly-whirly ammonites. Yeah, a flood burial for sure. And here's young Susie, who's come on board to help us with the museum project. And she's pretty happy because she's found a fossil nautilus, yet another living fossil, and a pretty sizable one at that. Now, we're going to deal with some polystrate trees in a minute, but really we need to get down to the issue of, well, what is the term polystrate, and is there anything else that's polystrate? Are there any other fossils that cut up through many layers? Well, let's give you an example of some. Here we are on a UK field trip last year. It's to a fairly famous place. We were digging up rocks. We were looking at limestone. We were finding fossils. And there is Mam Tor in the background, a fairly famous mountain or hill. And just round the corner is the Blue John Mines, one of the UK's most famous semi-precious stone sites. And there on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the black rock. Now, this is a black rock. It's a shale. It's a carboniferous rock. If you pick some of these loose bits up and give it a crunch and take a great big deep sniff, it smells like the backside of a diesel truck. And that's for a good reason. It's full of oil. It's full of organic material. It's full of carbon. And carbon is key because this is the carboniferous. Oh yeah, carboniferous is a English name for it, named because it's so full of carbon, whether that be coal or oil or polystrate trees. But of course, the Americans couldn't go with the English naming, so you refer to it as Mississippian or Pennsylvanian. But it's the same rock layer around the world. And yes, it is around the world. This isn't just a local flooding event. This is a major worldwide flooding event. And even this was picked up by secular geologists like Derek Ager. All right, what's the significance of this? Well, these are the kind of fossils that you can find in it. It's not just polystrate trees, like some of the carboniferous ones that John was pointing out. It's also these, well, can you see the fossil thorns? Yeah, let them oxidize a bit and they become really abundant and apparent what these fossils are. Fossil thorny things, sharp pointy things sticking out of the side. Now, we've been filming a whole series of programs with Dr. Diane Eager here in the UK, and one of the episodes specifically deals with thorns and the botanical side of things with thorns. But the biblical point is simple. If it's a sharp pointy thing that sticks out of the side of the plant, it is a thorn or a thistle. It's not part of the original very good world that God created. Now, this is significant for a number of reasons, and it has got a connection to polystrate trees, because these carboniferous rocks at Castleton underneath Mam Tor are supposed to be around 304 million years old, according to the secular literature. And here is a polystrate tree. Yes, we've come to them in the end, but we're also in carboniferous rocks. This is in Northumberland in the UK, up on the sort of northeast coast of England, just sort of underneath the borders of Scotland. And you can see a rather spectacular fossil tree next to me. This is one of those lycopods that John was talking about. You can see some of the bark still there, and inside is... Well, there's actually been a question about what's inside these rocks. I mean, this is a hollow plant when it was alive, so it's filled up with mineral infill, sediment infill, but don't be surprised, it's still got the full structure there, and it's actually a complete fossil tree. And there it is in context, and I'm digging down and excavating the base of this tree. Okay, what rocks are we dealing with? Well, carboniferous, about 318 million years old, according to the British Geological Survey. Yeah, these rocks are supposed to be very old indeed. And look what we're finding inside of them. Yeah, more fossil thorns. Now this tree was interesting because it certainly seemed to have a bulb on the bottom of it. It even seemed to have part of a root system. But at the base of it, there was no soil. There were no lycopod leaves or anything like that. It was full of various different fossils, but they were all jumbled together, and they included fossil thorns. Yeah, many fossil thorns. All right, what's the point of this? Well, if we're ever going to understand a bigger picture of this, if we're ever going to understand a biblical picture of this, we need to go back to Genesis for sure, because 318 million years old, according to the secular literature. Well, what does the Bible have to say about this? The Bible says it's not 318 million years old. How do you work that out? It's simple. Genesis chapter 3. Then God said to Adam, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, the ground is cursed for your sake, in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life, by thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. The Bible is emphatic that thorns and thistles are the result of the curse. The curse is the result of Adam choosing his wife over God, sinning against God, and as a result, the world was cursed and the world changed from good to bad. By the time you get to Noah's flood, the world had changed from good to bad to worse. That's why God had to send a flood to judge all of mankind. But the Bible is emphatic. Thorns and thistles were not part of the original creation. They were part of the curse, which only came about because man sinned. In other words, thorns and thistles only appeared on the planet after man was on the planet, specifically after man sinned. Therefore, these rocks are not 318 million years old. They're less than 10,000 years old, according to Scripture. You need the big picture, and you need the biblical one as well, if we're going to get anywhere. All right? We've shown examples of these fossil polystrate trees all over the world, many of them in this referred to as carboniferous rock. You see, this isn't a local site, and there's been suggestions in some secular literature that given tidal bores or tidal floodplains, you can get sometimes several centimeters of deposition in just a single event. Well, it's interesting evidence to look at the way that sediments can be laid down during flooding waters, but you really do need to get the big perspective of how big this flood was. Here we are in the Northumberland in the UK with fossil lycopod trees. And the real polystrate principle we're dealing with is the fact that it's very large-scale rapid deposition, because poly, as John has already pointed out, means many. Strate or strata refers to layers. These fossil polystrate trees protrude through many layers. In situ, me and John get in debates about this term in situ. You see, when I was in geology, I was taught that in situ meant in the rock, right? Positioned in the rock. So it hasn't been taken out of the rock. It hasn't been washed around. And when John was in university, he was taught that in situ meant this is how these trees lived here, died here, and got buried here. It's interesting how geology changes, but what is really key here is we're looking at the way that the tree has been buried. It hasn't been washed out of the cliff. It's not useless in terms of the information you can determine. It's still sitting in the cliff, and it's very clearly protruding up through many, many layers. Not the way that it lived there, died there, and got buried there, however. Here's a rather fantastic example from Northumberland. This is in the Carboniferous. You see the bark? You see the internal structure? Pretty great stuff. And of course, John's already pointed out, here's the ones from Nova Scotia. Also Carboniferous, also lycopods. Here's John Mackay. Hey, it's the same tree type. It's a lycopod. Same layers of rock, same coal seam at the base, no branches or roots. These didn't live there, die there, and get buried there. These have been ripped up and buried very quickly. And notice that it's sitting on top of a coal seam. You see, the argument that these trees lived there, died there, and buried there is put forward by the same people who argue that coal seams slowly build up over millions of years in a swamp-like environment. You realize you can't have them both ways? You can't have millions of years of slow deposition for coal and then have a tree plonked right on top of it where it supposedly lived there, died there, and got buried there, where there's no root bulb or no root material going down into the coal in the slightest. Yeah, this is Carboniferous Tennessee. And here we have another Carboniferous tree in Manchester. And this is the one John mentioned earlier, and we're going to dig a little deeper into it now. Oh, and of course, John also mentioned where he finished and I started the Newcastle, Australia trees. All right, I've actually been to see this tree myself in recent times, and I need to go back there again because, John did a load of research here and uncovered it and cleaned it all up, but it's actually ended up getting all overgrown again. This is sort of just outside of Manchester. You go and you find in the old literature, this is now unpublished, you can't really get hold of this very easily anymore. It's a book called The Geology of Manchester Area by Eager and Broadhurst. Interesting, these old geologists, they really went out there and told you what to see. There was very little interpretation. Most of it was go down here, turn left, go up the hill, over the hill, turn around, and you'll find this geology deposit here. Really useful stuff for being able to track and trace you back to where you need to find your geology. And there on the front page is a rather spectacular fossil tree, a polystrate tree. Polystrate tree is used in the technical literature, by the way. It was used by Professor Derek Agee. You'll find it's gone into the technical literature. It was even accepted when I was doing first and second year geology, and many of the papers that I wrote, I referred to them as polystrate, and they were accepted no problem because it is actually used by even secular scientists. And there's the tree that John found. It's a little bit different from the picture on Eager and Broadhurst. It's all overgrown. It's covered in gunge and algae, and it needed a bit of work doing to it. So that's what John did. He cleaned it up, sorted it all out, made it look all nice. And what I always found fascinating about this tree, and I've been there and seen it myself, and even Eager and Broadhurst had to point this out on page 56 of their book. The tree was overwhelmed by flooding, they said. And rapidly buried in its growth position. But not that it lived there, died there, and growed there. It was in growth position, as in it was standing upright, but they didn't claim that it grew there. Why? Well, it's very simple. First of all, we're definitely looking at a flood deposit, and we're definitely looking at a coal chemical process, because you can see the coal that the bark has turned into. There it is, pushed up right against there. But get down to the base of this tree, give it a good scrub out, and look at what you find. A second polystrate tree, also standing upright underneath the first one. These are actually a tree balancing on top of another one. This isn't a growth position where it lived and died and got buried, because trees don't grow on top of trees. And yep, there's the bark. It's definitely a second tree, no doubt about it, because the bark turns to coal very easily. There it is there. One big tree sitting on top of another tree. This is not a growth position as in where it lived and died and got buried there. It's something that's been overwhelmed by flooding and buried extremely quickly in a very, very large deposit. Still one of the Carboniferous rocks which go all over the world. There it is there. Interesting. Of course, you can do polystrate tree experiments. You can even do it with matchsticks in your jar of water, or you do it in a big tank like we have at Jurassic Ark. And you can find that occasionally, if you have it buried in water, these trees do go vertically and they do sink down vertically and sometimes even balance one on top of the other. And you introduce a slurry of sediment, flowing water, pushing it all together, and you've got yourself a large-scale flooding deposit, perfect for actually burying these polystrate trees. Definitely a flood deposit for sure. Well, the size of these Carboniferous, or as you call them in the States, Pennsylvania, Mississippian coal beds, well, this was actually pointed out by Derek Ager way back. He said this: the Carboniferous extends in essentially the same form from Texas to the Dantes Coal Basin north of the Caspian Sea in the USSR. Well, the USSR doesn't exist anymore, but the Dantes region has really been it's been talked about a lot recently with the war in Ukraine that's going on. So most people have a good idea where it is now. There's Texas, there's the Caspian Sea. This amounts, says Ager, to some 170 degrees of longitude, and closing up the Atlantic by a mere 40 degrees does not really help at all that much in explaining this remarkable phenomena. Yeah, these rocks are pretty extensive. They're all the same layers, they're all the same form, they all have the same polystrate trees. Interesting. Major flood deposits across the world, all buried in a singular flooding event. And even more remarkable is down in Australia, they've appeared and more has been uncovered of these Carboniferous polystrate trees since Derek Ager actually published his book. So this is a really big deposit. These flood deposits, just in the Carboniferous, are worldwide for sure. And you see, the point that polystrate trees show is they did not live there, they did not die there, they were stripped of their roots, and many times of their roots and most times of their branches. They have often rounded and abraded ends. There's no soil substance at the base. More often than not, it's just pure coal, and they're washed into position along with their sediment and buried very, very quickly indeed. But we can't just stop with polystrate trees, because they're a great example and they're a very visual example, they're a very big example, but you also need to break it down into, well, what other polystrate examples are there? Well, actually, Donnie, if you can put me on full screen so everybody can see me, I've actually got some fossil examples here, and they all have one thing in common. You see, here's a fossil that I'm going to show you on screen in just a moment. It's one that we collected a few years back. You might recognize that, John. You've got the chalk. This is from Hunstanton. You can clearly see all of the layers, and then you've got this fossil brachiopod, which is again cutting up through many layers. It's a polystrate brachiopod. And then you've got things like this, which is from the Ordovician in Tennessee. And you have land plants. Yes, I know land plants aren't supposed to be there in the Ordovician, but that's what we find. And the Tennessee Division of Geology just doesn't want to reclassify them. But that's a whole story for another day. But the reality is you've actually got the layers of rock, and then you've got the polystrate fossils, the plants actually cutting up through many layers, even though these are on a small scale and not a really large scale. And then you've got this fossil here. It's a trilobite, three-lobed thing, yeah, and it's rolled up. So not only is it buried in action, not only has it been buried very quickly while it's still alive, but look how thick that is. I mean, this has been buried through many, many layers, because the reality is, according to the secular literature, according to secular sites, these layers build up extremely slowly. Let me give you an example of that. Donnie, put me back onto the PowerPoint screen, and you can see a rather fantastic picture of Hunstanton, a place that I know know very well. I've visited many, many, many times, and I've published on it a number of times as well. Some rather interesting fossils from here. Oh, you see the white layers at the top, the chalk, the red layer in the middle, the red chalk or the Hunstanton Formation, and then the brown karstone at the bottom. And these are some of the fossils that we've collected there over the years. Oh, you see the giant ammonite there with the shark tooth buried in it and the sea urchin on the side? Well, look at the layers of strata. I mean, even though this ammonite is lying down in the rock, even just the thickness of the ammonite, the depth of the ammonite, means that it cuts up through layers of strata. But the vertical sea urchin on the right-hand side is really protruding up through layers. I mean, there it is there, taken on the beach. You see the sea urchin on the right-hand side? You see all the layers? There's the layers. It's a polystrate sea urchin. Oh, bonus point, you see the modern day one that I picked up off the beach right next to it. It's a living fossil for sure. Here's another example from Hunstanton. There's the chalk. Can you see all the layers? It's a polystrate belemnite. Well, a belemnite is a sort of a squid-like creature. It's the hard part, not quite the backbone, but it's sort of a hard part from the back of the squid, and it fossilizes. Well, it's the only hard part, so it can fossilize fairly easily if it's buried very quickly. And sometimes if it's buried in the right conditions, you even find all the tentacles as well. Well, this is a polystrate belemnite for sure. See how it's sitting upright through the layers? Yeah. And here's another one that we found many years back. There's the layers of sediment. There's the belemnite. In fact, this has even been published on first paper that I ever wrote for university, ended up using this exact diagram. You see the layers of strata. There's the belemnite. It's sitting at approximately a 30-degree angle. It's a polystrate belemnite for sure. And there's the fossil I held up just a moment ago. Oh, you see the brachiopod, and you see the little hole where the foot would hold it and anchor it to the sea floor. Well, actually, that's how we found it in the rock, in the cliff, in situ, as I say, which is how I dug it up, right? In other words, we can tell for sure that that's the way that brachiopod was sitting in the rock. In other words, it was upside down. You see, we've done surveys along Hunstanton, and the thing is, we've shown that over 93% of fossils have evidence of transportation, that these creatures didn't live there, didn't die there, didn't get buried there in the way that they were living, but has been caught up and swept up in flooding waters, actually moved into position. Oh, and you see the layers there? Yeah, it's a polystrate belemnite for sure. It's cutting up through many layers. What's the point at Hunstanton? Well, we've made it many, many times over and over again. You have about 20 meters worth of sediment there. That's 20,000 millimeters, supposedly deposited very slowly over 10 million years. Yeah, you can find it in the literature. This is chalk. It's supposed to build up slowly by calcareous ooze, which builds up very slowly as coccolithophores filter down through the sea and build up at the bottom. 20,000 millimeters in 10 million years. That makes an average rate of 0.002 millimeters per year, or 0.00007 inches per year. I mean, you can't even put your fingers that close together. Well, it would have taken just over 14,000 years to bury or lay down an inch of sediment, or 28,000 years just to bury the brachiopod. Now, this leads you on to a very important point that Derek Ager made. But let's look at another example, this time in Ireland, just across the sea from us. John went here a number of years back. Here's Northern Ireland, beautiful coast, beautiful scenery, beautiful rocks. Yeah, great big chalk rocks from there. And you can see there's actually the Cretaceous rock at the bottom. There's the Tertiary rock at the top. You're missing many millions of years in between those layers, just as an important side note. But there's some brilliant chalk surfaces there, some thick limestone beds there as well. And the claim is that the limestone beds took about 70 million years to form. You can pull all this up in the literature yourself. 1,000 meters in 70 million years averages out to 30 years per millimeter, or 700 years just to cover your big toe. Thick beds of limestone. What fossils can you find inside? Well, really interesting things, because there's a whole load of fossils down there, like more of these belemnite fossils, the hard parts out of these squid. There they are there. Beautiful fossils, really lovely, almost a sort of a crystal-like structure inside of them. And there you can see the layers of rock, the strata. And there's a belemnite, which is cutting up through many layers. In fact, you see what John's pointing at down there? There's the polystrate belemnite. Well, according to the secular literature, it took 14,500 years just to cover that. But there's a belemnite at a different angle. Now, that's really important, because it doesn't matter which way you want to argue that your layers are going. One of those belemnites has to be polystrate. They're at different angles to each other. There's more of them. More polystrate belemnites. Another one. They're all over the place. And Professor Derek Ager, in his book, The New Catastrophism, made this point. If one assumes, as most authors do, that the deposition of one ammonite zone lasted about 1 million years, these ammonite zones, by the way, are the ones that regarded that are found at places like Hunstanton in the Ceomanian. Then if this ammonite zone is 1 meter thick, this means it took 1,000 years to deposit 1 millimeter of sediment. And this led on to a very astute observation by Professor Derek Ager. If you really take this amount of time, 25,000 years just to cover your big toe, if you attempt to calculate rates of sedimentation based purely on the dates, then the results are usually ludicrous. And he's right. Whenever you do it, the results are ludicrous for sure. A really important point. So we need to get out of the sort of idea, out of the thinking that it's purely just these polystrate trees that we're dealing with. Essentially, Derek Ager's point is simple. Any fossil that you find is a polystrate fossil, simply because the rates of sedimentation, according to the dates, you'd have never had a fossil if that was true. Fossilization has got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process, and you need the process to be in place first and foremost. So if you're going to take vast periods of time, your time is just going to destroy your fossil, creature or organism long before it ever is into a fossil. So the very fact that you have existence of fossils shows that it has to be quick. I'll finish up there. Back to you, John, for any final comments, because you've been to many of these places, and I think probably a Q&A session soon.
Yeah, I think Q&A is good. So put me on full screen, Donnie, and then we'll come back together with Joe. Just so you know what we're doing here in Australia, for the first time since COVID, we are launching our interstate ministry again. In other words, we're driving over the border, not just flying, but going to run camps. Now, we haven't run a camp for nearly 3 years here in Australia because of all the strict COVID regulations. We had our first open day at Jurassic Ark just a couple of weeks ago, and a fabulous day. And people are welcome at any time to our venues. And I'd encourage you to go to creationresearch.net, click on museums, and you'll see a preview of Canada, the museum there with Martin. You'll see a preview of Joe's museum. Our one's here, Craig Hawkins in Tasmania. And if you're going to Tassie, make sure you travel a bit north of Hobart, and you'll see a fabulous creation museum down there. Just a reminder that if you want quite a few of the pictures that you saw today, you can actually download this item here, Creation, the Evidence from Polystrate Fossils, done quite a while ago. So you'll see a lot of the pictures in sort of postcard format, and you'll be able to get those. And you can also get that free. But these ones here are available as MP4s or as streaming. You will find them useful. The DVD series Darwin on the Rocks features quite a few polystrates because we took a team around the world, had about 5 or 6 cameramen in different countries, and we went and we traveled all over the planet. As one of our favorite reviews said, I got giddy following John Mackay so fast around the world. But it turned out to be a fabulous DVD, as did its sister one, Time's Up Darwin. So that's the theme of tonight, as you notice, with Joe using Professor Derek Ager's brilliant strategy to work backwards and say, well, is this evidence for millions of years, or how long did we have to do this? How much time is missing? And he ended up with a conundrum. But we'll come back with that. I'd encourage you, go to our website and notice, well, if you're watching in Australia, this one's just been released, Tights, Mites and Falsifies. And in England, Joe assures me the master we sent will be released over there shortly. So that's Tights, Mites and Fossil Mites, the second edition, upgraded and expanded, and a brilliant book. Sorry about Canada and the USA. We just haven't got to you folks yet, but God willing, we will. We have a rep getting going again in the USA. So Dr. Glenn, he's sort of trying to set up another Jurassic Ark in the USA as well. So God willing, this expanse will go. And yes, after this program, I start packing the car for a long leg of driving to a first camp in ages. But anyway, great to be with you. We will take questions now for a short time. I see there's quite a lot on the side there. So where do you want to start, George?
Well, firstly, this is why, again, the creation research team are some of my favorites, very comprehensive. And in light of the questions that we have, it's about to be probably the most comprehensive program available on Polystrate fossils. So I put together the most common objections or criticisms that I've heard. And I think I've heard them all, given how many debates I've hosted, moderated, and engaged in. But luckily, we've got a healthy amount of skeptics in the chat, brothers, who have sent in basically the same objections. So let's just utilize those and engage those for a bit. So, okay, I'll start right at the beginning. Joe and John, again, excellent presentation. I always appreciate how comprehensive you gentlemen are. So Taylor K has a question. Thank you so much, Taylor. And she asks, how do evolutionists attempt to explain the existence of polystrate fossils?
A good question. I'll take the first bit, then Joe can take the second, because he's had experience with fossil denial on a big scale in museums. Historically, the approach has been to ignore them. You heard the testimony of Bob in the USA, Bob Stewart. Never did his university in a course on geology take him to see any of these polystrate trees. So no explanation was given. Secondly, if you're going to acknowledge them, redefine them. So if you went looking for the term polystrate trees in major university libraries, no reference. If you even tried their more older term, upright fossils, no explanation. I know, because we spent hours upon hours going through all the data available in the university, no acknowledgement. And by the way, I saw a question there about why don't you use the scientific term upright fossils? Well, polystrate and upright are actually referring to the same thing. Polystrate's just better. Derek Age's use of it sort of brought it into mainstream, so you need to update your view of science terminology, because polystrate will become a bigger factor. We will insist on it and we will win, because it's exactly what the tree is. It's going through many layers, and polystrate is a far more endurable term than upright fossils. So change your definition back there and get on the boat while you possibly still can. Improve your terminology and get a bit more scientific than just having an attitude that wants to deny it. In terms of explaining it, if they do explain it and don't blow it up in the mind, like has been done with some of my finds, you will find that they tend to shy away from any record that brings you to a flood. Usually, if they will bring in a flood, it's a little flood, and you have to get used to the it took me ages to get used to the hidden mindset of geology is Noah's flood is out. So don't do anything that would even imply a flood bigger than sort of across a river or across a lake or across a floodplain. Don't discuss that, because people will think, big flood, Noah, straight away. And they're quite right. That's exactly what you do. So anything that would indicate rapid burial on a huge scale tends to be ignored or denied. Joe, what's your comment on that one?
I think another issue is generally in academia, particularly, and I haven't gone through it, I certainly know this, a trend is to focus on the specific. Now, that is needed sometimes, of course, and I'm not denying that. But if you're taught to study one particular fossil location, say the Northumberland fossil trees, right, you could come to the conclusion that it was a flood deposit. Eager and Broadhurst did in the Manchester trees. It's abundantly and clearly a flood deposit. And then if you're still thinking the way that Charles Lyell did, which is the present is the key to the past, then you'd go and start looking for modern day processes that could form such a flood deposit. And you'll perhaps find out that there's various places, like I think there was a paper published on the Hudson River a little while back that showed it could get up to sort of 20 odd centimeters of deposition in a single tidal flow. Well, that's great evidence of rapid deposition, but it's on a local scale, and this stuff then gets eroded again afterwards. And so if you're still thinking the way that Lyell did, you'd say, well, this perhaps could be an area which was overwhelmed by a number of local floods and eventually buried the tree. But what we try and encourage people, and every single field trip we lead and take people on, is trying to get the big perspective, right? Because you can't just explain it by a local flood because it's not a local deposit, as we pointed out. And it was Derek Ager who pointed this out as well, that the Carboniferous itself covers most of the planet. And this was before it was discovered in Australia, right? So it covers almost all of the planet. It's an enormous deposit. It's all the same trees. It's all the same flooding evidence. It's, in fact, John, we've found marine creatures buried next to these plants in the Carboniferous, right? So it's a flooding deposit as well. They all, as a general trend, sit on top of coal seams. So there's, even if you do have roots or root bases or root bulbs, the roots certainly don't extend down the way that trees would do into soil, because you've got a solid coal seam underneath it, and you've got loads of plant and, you know, leaf and stuff, fossils and ferns and so on and so forth, but no pine needles in the case of the Araucarias in Australia, no soil in any of these. So these trees have been ripped up, dumped up and buried. And this is a global deposit. It's a worldwide deposit. If you look at the Jurassic fossils that you find in Australia, it covers getting close to a quarter of Australia. Now, I've been to Australia. I know how big it is. If you want a flood big enough to cover a quarter to a third of Australia, it needs to be on a global scale. So you'll really need to take a step back sometimes and look at the much, much, much bigger picture. In terms of what John referred to in terms of covering stuff up, I'm sure I've covered this many times on the Standing for Truth channel before, but it's something that happened to me. Remember I mentioned Hunstanton? You've actually got fossil trees and timber at Hunstanton. Now, Hunstanton is supposed to be a shallow marine environment, right? And I've come across these fossil trees in the Carstone many times, and I found reference to these fossil Carstone trees in places like the Sedgwick Museum. Now, the Sedgwick Museum is in Cambridge, founded by Adam Sedgwick, a critic of Charles Darwin, and actually wrote in that you had to allow anybody coming in and having a look at his fossils. And you just go in and they've got something ridiculous like multi-millions of fossils just on shelf upon shelf upon shelf, right? I know you've been there, John, back when it was even better, because they've kind of modernized it nowadays. But I'd found references and I'd found samples of these trees in Carstone, so I assumed it was just a known thing. Of course, when you actually go to university and you get taken on a secular field trip, university field trip to Hunstanton, and the professor tells you, well, this is a shallow marine environment, and you ask him, what about the trees? Has he ever heard of the trees? No. And what you'll find is not only did he have no explanation for the trees, when I went back to the museum a little while later, which is associated with the university that I went to, right, it turns out that, well, those fossil examples had disappeared somewhere in the back of the archives. And when the next year came around and I asked that year's students, I was a year ahead of that point, so I asked the year students below me, when they went on the field trip to Hunstanton, did the professor mention the fossil trees? No, he said it was a shallow marine environment. Now, take of that what you will. It's a personal experience that happened to me, but it really does show that oftentimes they don't like you trying to question the narrative or shake the apple cart, as they say, rock the apple cart. So it's, I know similar stuff has happened to you as well, John. Generally speaking, this stuff is just pushed to the back of the mind and ignored, or sometimes just hidden away in order to avoid it questioning the narrative.
Okay, I'll add just a comment on that, Joe, then we can take another question. Professor Edgeworth, the original professor back there I mentioned earlier, he is emphatic. Trees that are pine trees buried with no pine debris, something's wrong, right? So his conclusion was that whole, and it's a big triangular section of Australia that heads up from Newcastle, it heads under Sydney, it goes down to Wollongong, but it heads back up into Queensland underneath the border ranges there. It shows up again in Queensland. He's emphatic that that had to all be washed in there. But of course, he's back in the early days, you know, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the concept of Noah's flood was still holding on to people's mindset. And he had no trouble talking about this was a flood deposit. But you won't find any reference to that today in the analysis of the current coal seams that are there, or coal deposition. Now, I've got some friends who are in the mine at Gunnedah, which is currently underwater again. It's been a floody season in Australia for sure. But you'll find that the normal story now, this is a slow swamp, slowly formed, slowly accumulated, and there are fossil trees the whole way through this. Now, you'll find that the dominant thought today is anti-biblical, anti-Noah. It's woke geology, you know. It's anti-God. It's anti-Noah's flood. It's anti-catastrophic. And you, as a student, don't learn this. It's just assumed and imposed upon you. So do what I did, or do what Derek Ager did, or do what I've encouraged young Joe to do. Go and see it for yourself. We have spent vast fortunes, and I mean that, traveling around the planet, photographing, visiting. I mean, ring up your local geologist and say, have you been all over the world looking at these fossils? Well, be blunt, you don't make any money digging up fossil trees. Who wants them? You can't sell them. There's no income from studying fossil trees. Studying coal, studying oil, studying diamonds. Now, yes, you get income from that. So most geologists spend their life purely in industry on financial things that can bring benefit to their employer or to themselves. You want to get studying the fossil lizards found inside fossil trees that are hollow? Sorry, no money. Museums, they don't support you to the hilt you can earn from industry for sure. So do a Derek Ager. That's why I admire him. He quit his universities up and traveled everywhere that he could. And he has got some great observations. And he's the guy who formalizes Polystrate. So check it out and use it. He's the guy who said, we can't explain the Carboniferous. Even if we squash the Atlantic together in continental drift, we've still got 120 degrees of the Earth's surface covered by this one bed, full of these trees that his old mates over there at Manchester University said, flood deposit, right? You have to include that. So pray for us. You want to support us, go to our websites. We can certainly use it in this post-COVID multi-prime minister days in the UK, in the days of collapsing finances everywhere. So find out how you can donate to what we're doing. Next question, Donnie.
Amen. Well said. Fantastic responses. Gentlemen, woke geology. I like that. And not the good kind of woke either. So appreciate that, John. Org, he's got a question here. And I'm glad he sent this question. From my understanding, Org is a working geophysicist. And he joined us several weeks back for an impromptu debate on this topic, actually, geology, polystrate fossils, and he presented this argument. So I'd be curious how you gentlemen respond. George, what I'll do, my good man, is I'll present this question, and then you pick the next one, brother. So Org says, why aren't polystrate fossils more common? Every tree would have been destroyed at once, yet very few trees are polystrate comparatively.
I'll give a few comments, Joe. You can add a couple of things. Sad to say it, it's a statement from ignorance. Now, I have followed the rocks from Newcastle, Alabama, right up through Kentucky, Tennessee, right up to Pennsylvania, across through Canada, out through Nova Scotia, across the middle of the ocean, through England, Manchester, Scotland, over into Germany, right down. And there are polystrates everywhere, millions upon millions of them that don't get recorded. If you want to put up the money, I'll take you on a personal field trip and we can travel the globe and you'll be amazed and staggered at how many polystrate trees there are. Secondly, in the last section, I will show you, if we've got the time before I have to start packing, exactly how polystrates form even in the present day world. And the surprising thing is how many trees actually survive a catastrophe and the evidence left behind on them that they have catastrophically been dumped. Joe, do you want to make any comment on that?
Yeah, well, just moving away from just trees, right? As we made the point, if you use Derek Ager's very good point of using the dates to work out the sedimentation rates, every single fossil is a polystrate fossil. Because if your sedimentation rates take more than, you know, a few hours to a few days to actually bury your fossil deep enough to stop it from decomposing, or your creature organism deep enough to stop it from decomposing, you're never going to get a fossil. So just the presence of all fossils, especially ones that cut through even a few layers, particularly in the case of chalk, where your calcareous ooze is supposed to form on tiny, you know, millimeters, you know, in hundreds or even thousands of years. Just the fact you've got a tiny little seashell is a polystrate fossil. So yeah, polystrate fossils are abundantly common, and as I say, part of the programs that we do, it's not just here's a random thing that we found, it's here are hundreds of thousands of these things that you find all over the world in the same types of layers, under the same types of conditions, and over and over and over you go. I mean, you can go to Newcastle, Alabama, Newcastle, England, Newcastle, Australia, they're all there, right? And strangely enough, they're all there, and they're all called Newcastle because there's a similarity. As people went out across the world, they found coal and said, hey, this is coal just like the one back at Newcastle, so we'll call it Newcastle. And so it's really all the same kind of rock as well.
All right, George, it's time we heard from you. A joke first, plus a question.
George, go ahead.
Thanks. This is more of a comment that someone made that I was interested in, and maybe you can expand on it. But I believe you showed a photo early on, John, of a polystrate tree going through a couple of layers. I believe one of them you mentioned was a diatomaceous layer.
Yeah.
He actually says he was explaining I'm assuming it's a he, by the way. He says that the trees were buried and fossilized during periods of rapid deposition. They never are in layers that are millions of years different. Now, I mean, I know of examples where limestone, even at their own deposition rates of, 1 to 3 centimeters per 1,000 years, you have fossilized nautiloids, all sorts of other creatures. Yet that seems to me they sort of pick and choose to choose their rescue device. Like they'll choose rapid deposition when it suits them, and yet they'll choose, slow deposition to argue the deep earth scenario. So maybe if you can expand a bit that, whether you know of examples where there are polystrate trees through multiple layers of different ages.
Okay, just to comment first of all, a polystrate tree which was out west of Bundaberg that we went and found in the diatomaceous earth is a local flood, right? So there are local floods happening in the immediate past or even today that will produce polystrates, right? So we will look at that. The diatomaceous one had a tree that was standing on soil. It was covered up rapidly by a flow of diatoms that had obviously come from up one end of the valley, as I said, and it was buried so quickly it couldn't survive. So it died off and was buried totally. So it is a polystrate tree, but it doesn't go through another series of layers. It goes through millions of layers of diatoms. Right now, normally you would argue diatoms grow slowly, so therefore this layer took hundreds of thousands of years. They're so tiny, to find even an inch or 2 centimeters of them would take you vast ages, all ignored because it doesn't fit the tree in the middle. Diatoms don't usually live around trees, so therefore they happily explain that on the basis of a local flood. But when you look at the polystrate trees that pass through layers that are radiometrically dated to be millions of years difference, let's illustrate something. When you want to radiometrically date something, if I take a specimen now, say of a dinosaur bone, and I want it carbon-14 dated, you usually don't have to tell, or don't tell the laboratory where you got it from. You don't even tell them it's a dinosaur bone, because if you did, they would tell you, sorry, it won't have any carbon-14. And so if you keep the information from them, then you will find out that many dinosaur bones do have carbon-14 in them, right? And you can even find lists of them just put down as anomalies. But the one thing people rarely do, unless you have megabucks, you see, my carbon-14 bone probably cost me up to $700 to actually get dated, and that's on the illicit side of the official form. What you'll find is if you want to radiometrically date the layers, you can't do it unless you have some sort of volcanic ash in the layer, right? It's from the volcanic material that they will usually go looking for the radiometric dating. And again, it's going to cost you a small fortune. So the bottom line is, unless there's a good economic reason for doing this, it's not done. So the general answer to your question is, go hunt the literature yourself and you won't find any data, because it simply is not done. It's just not economic to do that. In reality, you're going to have to go through multiple layers. Remember the tree I showed you at Newcastle? It went through layer of ash, layer of coal, layer of ash, layer of coal, layer of shale, layer of coal. And it went through multiple layers, probably 100 of each of those. Now, you couldn't even do a carbon-14 on the coal, because being not carboniferous, being the Permian coal that it is, it won't show a carbon-14 date according to the experts. And you can date the general ash, but in reality, it doesn't help you at all, and it's not done because it's not worth doing. You're there to dig up coal. So, Joe, do you want to add anything to that? Because I think I'd better move on to my next section, because my due date to start packing is coming up shortly.
Well, I think you better move on straight away, John. I think you covered that fairly comprehensively. It's sort of 10 to 1 in the morning here, so...
right, okay, yeah.
Start to wrap
okay,
up.
well, put me back on the screen, Joe. I mean, put the slideshow back up.
There you go, John. Looks good.
Let's deal with this question. How did they get their past, present, and maybe future? Let's go to Alaska again. Here we are. Another trip to the same site here, abandoned coal mine, fossil tree in Alaska. You can see, and from a distance, you can say, well, that looks like it's got no tree roots. I went one step further, and I won't bore you with every bit of digging because it took many, many hours to excavate, but you've seen us digging some of the trees up there. Let's give you a look. Let's excavate one of these to prove the point. You actually get underneath the tree, and you can hunt for roots anywhere you like. There are none. This is a upright tree with base to the bottom and thinner top up above, and there are no roots. It's a broken tree. Take you close up, right? This tree did not grow there. It was washed there. It washed there because it's in mud, and it does have some volcanic ash in it. So here we are in Alaska, a coal place. Nobody bothers to do this unless you are a creationist wanting to make a point to actually disprove the evolutionist claim that he's imposing upon it. He didn't see it take millions of years. He didn't run any tests to prove coal takes millions of years. They just dug it up because it's economic, and the rest is, well, ignored by the world. Let's go to a well-known catastrophe. Okay, there we have Mount St. Helens, and I was blessed to be in the area shortly after this, and one of my colleagues, Bob Powell, was at ICR at the time and helped do the research on Mount St. Helens, where you ended up with millions of trees knocked off the mountains, dumped in nearby Spirit Lake, whereby they floated, and some of them are still floating there. And they ended up standing upright. They're not on the bottom, they're standing upright, beginning to float at an angle, and while many of them are still actually floating. And as I've been there over the years, yes, that's my picture. I've been over the years, I've watched one thing happen. Many of the trees will float. You can see some of them still standing upright in the background, but as they're floating, they differentially will lose bark. It seems that yeasts and the bacteria get underneath the bark and strip it off. So the horizontal logs are still floating, but underneath, and yes, this came from the time Bob Powell was there, you'll see the broken logs, yep, you see smashed off in a volcanic eruption, standing upright and beginning to, well, the bottom is slightly thicker, so it gets waterlogged first and it heads down and ends up on the bottom in the midst of piles of bark, and you end up, well, let's show you what you end up with. Going on a smaller scale. How did the trees get to be vertically? Because any plant soaks up water from the bottom, alive or dead. Here we have a stick. in a lake. One of them's horizontal and one of them is already floating upright and proceeding to sink. So you find any plant will do this. Go and look at the beach, go and look at the rivers. You'll find all of your plants will first of all float horizontally. And this includes grasses and seaweeds, by the way. And then they will soak up water from the bottom, and some of them will end up sinking while others are horizontal, while others are still inclined. If you start from the left-hand side of the slide, you have a horizontal one. If you have a look next, you have one that's still vertical and the top is poking out. If you have a look at the next middle one over and above it, it's underneath the water, but it's still vertical. And if you look at the right-hand side, you have one that's actually starting to sink, but the top is still exposed and it's at 45 degrees. So this is how trees behave when they've been removed from their normal place and they end up in the water. Okay, diversion back to Mount St. Helens. I have been blessed with having abundant time and good legs and plenty of strength to actually get through the area after many floods went through. Yes, the Tuttle River has been exposed again. New plant growth above it, but in the section there, what you find is there's, oops, let's go back. I thought it came up next. There we are. Can you see the buried log standing upright in the middle of that shot? Yes, I couldn't get past the river, so that's a long distance shot, but take my word for it, it is a standing upright one. And if the sediment was any bigger, because that's all volcanic ash, you would end up with a potential for a woody tree to become a fossil tree that turns to stone. How do I know that? Well, the flood that time had also exposed this tree in the middle of the river. Now, it definitely wasn't there before the big explosion. The explosion, by the way, is back in the early 80s. This is getting to be a long time ago now. And you'll notice one thing, it was exposed, blown up, and what came with it was its entire root system. Right now, if you want to be very careful, you can actually trace the roots through to the end, and even the tiny roots that got blasted out of the forest, some of them go right to the end, but many of them are broken. If you want to spend a boring afternoon checking on fossil roots, this is the way to do it, because you and I would assume there's the tree upright, there's the roots, the river has just eroded things around it. No, that tree and that lava at that ash all came in at the same time. It's full of strata, and the roots, some are intact, some are broken. Going back to a previous eruption, this one is at least a couple of centuries old. It's a cutting not too far from Mount St. Helens, but if you get there, you'll notice there are what appears to be blobs. You climb up a bit closer, and what you get is fossil trees that are now silica. They're petrified trees, and they're standing upright. And you find enough of them, they've got no root bases. Some of them have got roots on them. But like that, it all came in volcanic ash. And within a couple of hundred years, these have been turned to stone. Doesn't take millions of years. They didn't grow there. This is volcanic deposition in the same way that the present day eruption produced trees, part trees with no bases, some trees with bases and broken roots, some trees with some roots intact. Go a bit further to Yakima in Washington. I tell you what, the Lord has provided us with some wonderful adventures over the years. Can you see the tree in the middle of that lava flow? Look, there's yours truly in the middle of the lava flow. Fortunately, once it's cooled down, and these trees have been preserved upright. In fact, good photographic positioning, beautiful silica. And you say, how does this happen? Well, you trace down to the bottom and you find the tree has got no root base. And underneath it is a different volcanic ash layer. It's obviously been covered in water. There's been water into which the basalt flowed, bringing many of the trees with it. And the water has produced, well, hot water, steam, etc. That's bubbled up through the basalt, and it's brought with it all the dissolved minerals that are in the basalt. And this tree has now been silicified. Whether you like it or not, trees, living or dead, soak up water, and they will soak up the minerals that are in the water. In fact, they will soak up the minerals that they normally soak up in life. So the trees around Newcastle have soaked up one sort of mineral. The trees around Washington State have soaked up different sorts of minerals. And some trees have soaked up no minerals at all because they're hollow. They fill up from the top. In fact, to go one step further, what's in them? The hollow ones. Well, there's one of my favorite Tennessee trees. We're in a coal mine. Can you see there probably used to be a poor squash miner at the bottom of that? You get up close and you'll find it's full of plant fragments. You go to this one that Joe talked about and you'll find it's full of mud. There's coal around the outside, but that's the only part of the tree that was solid. And inside is mud. Now, sometimes we can find where the mud poured in. The tree has been solid enough. You don't get coal if the tree has only got a couple of cell layers thick. The outside of this tree was solid enough to be exposed to the ash, the volcanic ash in the mud, which has turned to clay, and it is the clay which turns the tree to coal. But you will find also breaks in the tree, which the mud will flow through and fill it up. And sometimes you'll find interesting things come inside the trees. So to go back to where they first entered the literature, not as polystrates, because that word has come into practice more recently. Go to Nova Scotia. There's my first picture of Joggins. I'm there deliberately to go and see the layers. It used to be a coal mining area. The whole district is full of coal mines. Now abandoned, you can see why. Pretty unsafe areas to get into, but still much exposure. You will see the bases of the trees sitting on thin coal seams, sometimes thick coal seams. Oh, and down to the right-hand side, can you see the tree in the middle of the picture, bottom? And it comes up through a coal seam and out the other side? Yep, that's what they do. Thick base through the coal seam. It didn't grow in the coal seam. It was already there when the layer that turned to coal is forming. And you'll find the tree at the top. So you'll find evidence of washed in material. But washed in include what made Charles Lyell's study so famous. Now, that's in the nearby museum. I haven't been to this museum for years. I'm assuming it's still there. But it's famous because inside one of these trees, look at what Lyell found. Okay, excavation. You find that these trees which are hollow, which have breaks, or sometimes the top is broken off, and the water brings in mud, animals, fishes, reptiles, amphibians. I mean, there's the attribute. This is where pioneering geologist Charles Lyell discovered reptiles that evolved. Now notice that the present day literature promotes evolution, and yet it's 1842. Darwin hadn't even written his book yet. So the concept of evolution is being posed on Charles Lyell, who was not an evolutionist at that time. He was bringing in vast ages, but he was not an evolutionist. Of course, Charles Lyell and the others end up later in the British Museum attributing them the key theme of geology. The present is the key to the past. There is no Noah's flood at present, so don't use it in your explanations. Lyell was on the point of getting rid of flood, catastrophic, creationist geology and beginning to influence even our Australian museums. Recent article from the ABC on how the first evolutionist curator at the Sydney Naturalist Museum got kicked out because he'd become an evolutionist. Nothing new under the sun, hey? Oh, Lyell and Charles Darwin, there's the connection. Lyell became an adherent of Darwin, and Darwin had already become an adherent of Lyell. And in fact, Charles Darwin writes, I've always feel as if my books came half from Lyell's brain. So implicit in Lyell's millions of years is the theory of evolution. And it's implicit because Steno sadly blew his interpretation of the layers, making one on the bottom first, etc., etc. And we've done that before. Okay, let's go to Glasgow. Yes, here we are at the museum there, not far from the university. It's turned into a museum, a Polystrate tree museum. Now, I can't say it's a very popular museum. Who on earth wants to go looking at tree stumps? I remember going there first, and because I'd been lecturing in geology, I had free reign to have great access to these trees. And of course, you'll notice that they are spaced. It's very interesting when you say a fossil set of trees lived there, died there, grew there, etc. Can I encourage you, if you believe that, measure the distance between the trees, because sometimes they're right beside one another in a way that you'd never get them in any living forest. Sometimes they're on top of one another, again, in a way you'd only get them if they were flooded in. And sometimes the two are far apart to actually be a forest of anything at all. But this is always portrayed as a fossil forest. But interesting enough, having full access to the curator at the time, look what was found between the trees. Now, can you see the tail? Can you see the backbone? Can you see the legs? Because you see what was found between the trees was a whole specimen of this guy with his head up looking shocked. So if you want to explain how those trees got preserved, they were so rapidly buried that this amphibian didn't have time to turn around and yell, "Help, watch out." No, he was catastrophically flood buried. So what do you find in the hollow trees? The one that some people complain aren't trees. Well, you can call them trees. It's just a 10, 20 meter, sometimes the biggest one I've seen was 30 meters tall of one of these hollow trees. And you find in the mud, you find in them seashells, you find in them reptiles, you find in them amphibians, all rapidly buried. So they're still intact. Some of them have been dismembered. They are untacked and just the remains disturbed around. What's in them? The solid ones. Well, here's Joseph. Hey, you enjoyed that trip, Joseph. When are you coming back? We'd love to have you here again. But also did Dr. Andy McIntosh. And Dr. Andy, by the way, really likes our new updated version of Tights and Mites. He just emailed the other day saying, "Great work, John." So he'd encourage you to pick it up, same as we would. But look, there's the one we're interested in to finish with. There's Joe at the bottom. That's the bottom of this tree, by the way. This is why Professor David Edgeworth said something's wrong. Joseph's pointing out fossil leaves that are definitely not pine trees. But the question that kicked off this is, what is in the trees? In the hollow ones, you've got reptiles, fishes, you've got plants, you've got all sorts of things. In the solid ones, well, I'm going to get Donnie to put me back on full screen so that I can actually explain this last part. Now, I was puzzled by these inside contents. We have a few on display. We bought some up from Newcastle to Jurassic Ark. And actually, if you chemically analyze them, the red color is caused by iron. But the red color often preserves the total structure of the tree intact. But then if you do more careful study, you find that there's actually a chemical gradation up the tree. The red color is iron, but it's various sorts of iron. So at the bottom, you'll find iron sulfates, iron, all sorts of interesting stuff. Iron oxides near the top, and then the tree will silicify. And you say, why is this actually so? Now, the more I've checked on this, it again brings back to the same point we made as to why do they sink vertically. You see, they're lying horizontally, or in life, they've been standing upright. And if you think of a big tree or a little tree, they have an incredible property. They can suck water and minerals. And trees need iron. Trees need calcium. Trees need all sorts of minerals. And they will suck them up. Trees need silica. Now, if you don't believe me, go to your gardening shop and say, if I use a silica compound, will it improve my plant growth? Ah, yes, here's a packet, right? You can buy them at every plant dealer who knows what he's talking about. Trees absorb silica. They use it to strengthen their cells. These are the solid ones, right? The pine trees and things like that. And when you put your plants in water, if you put the plant in there, the tree will suck it up and use its internal pumping machine to pump the silica and everything else it needs right to the furthest tip. Now remove the life of the tree, cut it off. You will find it still somehow, we don't know how, sucks up the plant material. It sucks up the minerals. But now it behaves more like a chromatographic tube. Some of you are old enough, George is old enough, I know, don't know about Donnie, George is old enough to remember blotting paper. And it was great fun to get a bottle of red ink and blue ink and black ink, put it in a drop on the blotting paper, and it would begin to spread out. right? And then the different colors would begin to separate because the molecules making those colors are actually different sizes and different weights until finally they will sort out into a whole gradation. Now in chemistry, we used to use this to analyze what was in a compound, make a mixture of it and then put it in a tube and follow the whole thing up so gravity would be an extra factor separating out the chemicals. Well, this is exactly what's happened. Alive, plants do it and they keep it together. Dead, they don't. Dead, they'll pull up what they can and the silica will reach the top and siliciFy the tree, if there's any silica there. But apart from that, the trees around Newcastle are full of rock, solid iron, and even that can preserve the beautiful tree shapes. So again, not long time, catastrophe in the present world, silica in the vertical trees in the Mount St. Helens area from even recent eruptions, and you'll find you get the hollow ones, and they have all sorts of interesting things that have been dumped in the tree by flood water flooding in. I think that's enough for me. Probably time for a few more questions, George or Donnie.
I do remember those ink nibs, John, and the ink wells at primary school, though, shortly before the biro actually came out.
Well, I used to remember them because you actually get the girl in front of you who had a long pigtail and you would dip her hair into the inkwell and she, because hair can't feel, it would start acting up the hair like chromatograph. So I learned that lesson very early.
What an American.
Okay, gentlemen, let's move on to the next question. And again, thank you so much for all of the amazing information. I want to encourage the audience to share this content around. The truth is important. I've also pinned the playlist with all of our previous shows with John and Joe, which amount to about 17. So lots of good information for you guys. This question comes in from Forka Kong, saying for truth, why are polystrate forests only found in certain punctual areas? A swampy area that got mud flooded, for example, could explain this.
Again, I hate to say it, I'll be as nice as I can, but your statement is ignorant. If you want to call the area from Newcastle, Alabama, all the way across to Russia, a swampy area that got flooded, you go right ahead, but I think you need to redefine the dictionary. You see those fossils also head down to Western Australia, where you keep the same bed going and your area of muddy swamp is not getting better. You're calling it a polystrate forest. That's because you've swallowed the literature. Polystrate fossils would be better. You see, when I go into Kentucky and you find fossil sharks mixed with the coal, you got to say, this is just like my fossil coal mixed with horseshoe crabs. There's marine influences, there's all these things. And so you definitely have catastrophe, but a swampy, muddy area, unless you want to redefine area as half the globe, go right ahead. Joe, you got any comments on that one?
Final extra quick little comment, right? If you go to some of the largest swamps on Earth today, you'll find that there aren't polystrate trees forming. So you are correct in one element. You would need to have a swampy area getting mud flooded. Of course, if you go to the Newcastle, Australia trees, it doesn't really work because they're pine trees and they don't like swamps. But you are right in saying that there needs to be a flood, and that flood needs to carry sediment, whether that's mud or sand or a mixture as it usually is, to actually bury them. But you do have to ask the question, which very few people do, where did that mud come from in the first place? Because sediment comes from erosion. So if you're dealing with things like sandstone, right, you need approximately 3 times more rock to erode away to make 3 times less sandstone. And so you need a mechanism to be able to erode that stone, create that mud, make that sediment to actually flood it in the first place. So it's not just as easy as saying it's a standard Lyellian sense of thinking, here's a swamp that got overwhelmed by mud flooding. Well, where did that mud come from and where did the flood come from? Particularly when you scale it up to the size of, as Professor Derek A just said, 170 odd degrees of the Earth's surface, right? It's an enormous amount of area.
Very good, gentlemen. Go ahead, John. Okay, so next one comes in, another skeptic question. So we've got all the skeptics here, and we always appreciate their objections. It keeps this as comprehensive as possible. So Grayson Audette asks, Does John acknowledge that there are upright tree fossils with delicately preserved root systems and evidence of growth after burial began, which, according to him, disproves a quick, violent flood?
Okay, I already dealt partially with that. When you get a whole tree root system ripped up in a volcanic eruption, yes, you do find delicately preserved roots in the huge root ball that was picked up with the log, even when it's eroded away like that flood in the Tattle River in the USA. So that will do it, but you don't get vast millions of them dumped like that with roots intact, because just go to the next one down the road and check its roots, right? So you'll find that unless all of them are like that, having one of them that's like that is far better to explain by ripping up the whole thing and dumping it than it is by saying this was a fossil forest, look at all the roots. Now, let me just show you one thing that I've done to check on this, because it's a good question, occurred to me many years ago. So if you download this one here, one of the first things I did, because the professors in Nova Scotia were emphatic they grew there. I'll bring up this as close as I can get. Can you see the picture with the coin in it? Okay, that's about,
Yeah,
you want to put it on full screen, George?
Yeah.
There we are. Okay, there we are. Now you can see I've traced down the roots. You can see the coin for scale. That's about the size of, twice your thumbnail or whatever. And you'll see the layers, and the layers are actually going up to the root and then continuing on the other side. Now, if this was a normal tree growing with roots down through the sediment, I dug up living tree systems, and the one thing I've noticed is that the roots distort the soil. They will push the soil aside. They're brilliant at it. They will even lift rocks out of the road. That's due to their ability to use water as a huge pressure source and basically have a hydraulic jack on rocks and things like that. They also have little hair coming out the side, which will exude acid as it dissolves its way through the soil. So you can always tell if a root system has been preserved in place, because A, it's exuded acid. There's a chemical difference between the soil it's gone through and the soil that's immediately left around the root. And secondly, you'll find pressure zones where the root has pushed aside what's around it. Now, in all of these trees, I could find no evidence that this grew in place, but plenty of evidence the tree, the root, and the sediment were all washed in by the same force. So you can actually run a thorough check on that one, and I encourage you to go and do the same research, just as I'd encourage those of you in England. Sorry you can't go to the museum opening tomorrow. I certainly won't be there except by video, and but have a look at some of the evidence for yourself. Our museum in Tasmania, Craig Hawkins runs it. Keep up with him, because he's been amazed when people have come and said, I've never heard this before. Right? I'm pretty sure you should be grateful to Standing for Truth, because so much of what you hear on here today, you've never heard before. And your questions may be genuine, but they are based on not going out and checking what's really there. And remember, the Bible text says, check everything, only keep the things that are true. God told you to do that. I'd recommend you do it, because then you find, God's smarter than we thought he was, and God needs to be served and acknowledged. Okay, Donnie, I'm going to have to fly. Been great to be with you. Joe probably needs to go to bed too, because it's 2 o'clock in the
just
UK.
add one thing onto the end of that there, John. The paper that you held up there, that can be accessed in PDF form. The published paper can be accessed in PDF form via the Creation Research website, so you can see all of the examples and the data from around the world. So that's available. I think it's just creationresearch.net on part of the Polystrate research. So
yeah. Very good.
Okay,
Thank you, Joe.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for
Thanks.
your time. As always, that's 2+ hours. We got through some great questions, and again, excellent presentation. So any final words from you, John and Joe? And as always, thanks so much for being here.
Well, from my point of view, just pray for us as we make a long drive over the next day and a half. And for the camp, we're dealing with woke, waking up to woke, how to deal with woke theology, woke geology, how to study God's word to know it's true from the beginning. So just pray for me. First 4-day camp since COVID came in. So I'm really rejoicing getting out there doing something in the field with lots of people. Joe?
Amen.
Well, I've got a busy day tomorrow as it's our last day before the open day. So we're going to be getting the rest of the museum ready and set up and sorted and organized. And so pray for us over here. And a reminder that the best thing that you can do is actually go out and see the evidence for yourself. That's why we do field trips. That's why we take people all over the world. That's why we travel all over the world. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking to an audience in the States, Australia, or the UK. We can say, look, we've been here, done that. Here's the evidence, right? So get out there and actually dig up some stuff yourself. It's always the best.
Well,
and also
George,
subscribe to the Creation Research newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
You'll get it emailed. There's lots of information in there that you can get on a monthly basis, I think. Is it, John?
Yes, we have two forms. We have an electronic one which comes out semi-weekly, and we have a printed one which comes out quarterly to Australians. The email one goes everywhere around the planet, and they're both free. So free you can afford.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with free.
Here.
George, go ahead.
Thanks again, guys.
Good on you.
Great stuff.
Okay, gentlemen. Thank you so much. We'll let you get out of here. I'm going to do a quick outro, and then I'll be back to the audience because I do have some announcements and reminders to make before I completely shut this down. So, Joe, thank you so much. Get some sleep, brother, and fantastic job. Okay, I'll be back in about 15 seconds, guys. So stay where you are. We got some announcements. All right, I am back, and that was a very comprehensive 2 hours with two of my favorite young earth creationists, John Mackay, the creation guy, Joseph Hubbard. I love how these brothers really come at the critics. They're doing excellent research, and they deserve all the support that they can get. They are always a blessing and just extremely knowledgeable, an encyclopedia worth of information. So real quick, I want to thank, thank you so much, Acoustic Hills. Thank you so much, my brother. $50 super chat. So you guys are the life and blood of this channel. You guys are the reason why we're able to put out full-time content and do ministry full-time. Releasing so many books, putting on so many debates. As a matter of fact, this year has flown by. So with the Evolution Debate Challenge series that we've hosted, the prolific Evolution Debate Challenge series, we've now done roughly 50 of them. I've just booked another 5 for the next month. And so, George, well-deserved, brother, well-deserved. You're the award-winning co-host. So please sign a few autographs in the chat and then go enjoy some pizza, because I know this is early for you and late for me. We're all on different time zones. So again, thank you so much, Acoustic Hills, for the super chat. Also to Pure Aussie Gold. Thank you so much. Coffees and teas all around. Yes. It's a great coffee for a great show. And I'll be refilling this as soon as I'm done here with the announcements. And of course, some reminders. So, excuse me for the lingering cough from last week's 4 days of sickness. So, thanks for all your time and effort. You make the channel, brother. Thank you so much. Appreciate the kind words. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Stacy Turbeville, good to see you here. And amen. Amen. Polystrata or polystrate trees are one of the, if not the best evidence. It's a double whammy. Their existence refutes both an old earth and also evolutionism. Okay, because if you remove time, as Kent likes to say, remove their pacifier, right? Time. And then you remove any chance or opportunity at taking your fish to fishermen, your bacteria-like organism to biologists, your pond scum to people. They require billions of years. And so the existence of polystrate trees destroys both paradigms, deep time and also universal common ancestry, the type of ancestry that says whales and pine trees are related. So without time, without their pacifier, the hero of the plot, they don't have evolution. They don't have deep time. So what we wanted to do here, two geologists, two well-trained geologists, jack of all trades, John Mackay, Joseph Hubbard. We wanted to come together in light of all the debates, in light of all the open discussions that we've had on this channel with skeptics and critics. We wanted to basically provide you guys the most comprehensive show possible on polystrate fossils and trees specifically. So, you know, we've heard the criticisms, the objections. We had our favorite skeptics in the chat, and we always appreciate that, guys. We don't want to be an echo chamber, so we always appreciate the critics, the skeptics. We want to make these shows as thorough as possible. And so that was basically 2.5 hours of polystrate fossils. Please share this content around, guys. The truth is important. So I've been getting a lot of questions about endogenous retroviruses. So I do want to remind people, I've written a 200-page book, and basically every single question you can think of pertaining to this topic, you'll find answers to in this book. So it is available on the website. It's available on Amazon. It's available in the description box of this channel. So please, if you have not yet picked it up, definitely get yourself a copy. I've also got the special creation, updated and expanded, where you're going to find comprehensive answers to basically everything in the world of ancestry, including chromosome 2 fusion, endogenous retroviruses, molecular clocks, mitochondrial Eve, Y chromosome Noah, Neanderthals, human evolution, genetic entropy, so much. It's about 300 pages, so it's packed with information. And of course, the release of my new book here, End Times Revealed, Dawn of the Antichrist. Again, 311 pages to be exact, with the addition of an appendix debunking hyper-dispensationalism and a few other topics. So I see the reviews coming in. Praise the Lord for the great feedback. And I'll be starting basically part 2 now of my End Times Theology series. So I've put out 10 episodes. I did one formal debate, and then we also did an open mic debate for nearly 3 hours. I had Dr. Kent Hovind here with me, and we engaged people of differing eschatological positions. So we were comprehensive. And then that all led up to the release of this book, which you can even see behind me. I mean, I've got a ton of material and books on end times theology. I've studied all the various positions, and I'm here to tell you confidently that this book specifically will give you the most sophisticated and consistent model in terms of end times theology. So with the release of this book, there's a lot of information in this book specifically. You should be able to find the links easily to go get yourself a copy. But there's a lot of points in this book that I have not elaborated on in the series thus far. So I've got many new slides ready, visuals, charts, and I am going to be starting part 2 of this series soon. So it'll be another 10 episodes, and it'll be more comprehensive than the previous 10 episodes. I've had a lot of questions coming in over some of the specifics of that series, as well as when I'm going to continue that series. And so I'm here to tell you I'm continuing it soon. Let me see here. Super chat coming in from Stacy Turbeville. Thank you so much for the support. Stacy's been here before. He had the epic debate with Kent Hovind on preterism. I think that's sitting at 12,000 views roughly. So that was definitely a debate to remember. So we've got Grayson Audette in the chat, and he'll be the next to take the evolution debate challenge. I am pumped. Grayson, we're going to keep you busy. I always love seeing fresh faces, getting new people in on these debates. And this month specifically, we're going to have a few fresh faces, actually. So Grayson, we're going to keep you busy with debates, my good man. I know Grayson, Thank you so much. He's read my special creation book. And so him and I will be debating in the future. We're going to have a cordial, sophisticated debate on special creation. The last debate I had specifically on one of my books was with Luca Medugno, chemist over in Italy. He read my endogenous retrovirus book, and then we debated it. You know, I like to write books, put out content, but also defend them in live discussion and debate. So, Grace, I look forward to that. But before that, we're going to have you take the Evolution Debate Challenge. Dr. Dino, Grayson Audette, this will be November 4th. So this is going to be epic. I've got another guy, Preston. He'll be debating Dr. Dino. I'm working on a 3-on-1. I've already got 2 evolutionists. I'm looking for one more, but I should have that one more chosen. We'll be good to go for that as well. We're getting a round 4 with Wade the Wizard and Kent as well. And that's just the start of it. So we are going to end this month strong. Reminder, Matt Slick and Jake, the Muslim metaphysician. This is one of the more anticipated debates this year. This one's going to be huge. A lot of people looking forward to this one. I'm looking forward to this one. 2 top level debaters, both very knowledgeable. Matt Slick, he's a good brother. He's been here, I think 11 times, 12 times, maybe. He's been here a ton of times for debates. So this one has been moved to November 8th due to some unforeseen circumstances. So, but nonetheless, it is happening November 8th. And I'm looking forward to it. So make sure to mark that one off on your calendars. Time flies by. That'll be here in no time. This Saturday, Turretin fan and Kelly Powers. This one is going to be this is an important debate. This is going to be an awesome debate. I'm really looking forward to this one. And so this will be this Saturday. Does John 6 teach the Calvinist doctrine of effectual calling? So the classic Calvinism debate. Kelly Powers, he's had a ton of debates. He's a seasoned debater. Turretin fan, he's had a ton of debates. He's a seasoned debater. Stacy, I just saw your comment. Yes, we're going to get you some more debates as well. Stacy Turville, you always make for good debates, and I look forward to having you back on. For anybody in the chat, I'm looking for debaters in the world of the Bible translation controversy. I need some Roman Catholics to step up. I've had Robert Sungenis on several times. We need some more Roman Catholics to step up. I've got several, I guess you could say, anti-Roman Catholic apologists, so those debunking Roman Catholicism who are looking for debate, specifically Steve Christie. And so if you're a Catholic and you're willing to debate topics like the Marian dogmas debate, please reach out to me. Let's set it up. These debates are very important. So also in the world of Unitarianism, oneness, I just said on the channel a debate coming up on, is oneness biblical or heretical? Kelly Powers versus John Barton. So this one is on Saturday. And again, Matt Slick and Jake, the Muslim metaphysician. This one's still happening, and it is happening on November 8th. This one is still happening. We confirmed it for good last night. So Eli Haytov, J.D. Martin, what is true biblical salvation, free grace or lordship? This one is happening. I updated it on the channel. I think it's the 26th, but maybe double check just to make sure that I'm not a day or two off. So the 26th, we're basically filling up November. I'm starting to schedule shows for December as well. So again, if you're interested in debates, please do reach out. Let me know. And the bigger list that I have, the easier it is for me to set up debates and basically match people up. So I'm just looking at the chat here, guys. And again, thank you so much. Oh, it looks like my award-winning co-host George Bonds got a super chat. Note how Grayson agreed that those layers weren't of different ages, proving our quick burial flood model. So he's coming at you. Grayson, George and Grayson, best buds. I look forward to having Grayson for many debates in the future. Guys, let's end this year strong. We've done a ton of debates now. We've hosted over 230 on all sorts of topics. So what we're probably going to do in December is have a few of us here, me, Matt, maybe Redefine Living if he's up for it, Dr. Dino himself. And since we'll probably wrap up the year at about 60 in terms of the Evolution Debate Challenge, which I find hilarious because some of the more, militant, sorry to be mean, but snowflake evolutionists out there in the evolution world, they were basically saying, don't take the evolution debate challenge. They didn't want people to take it. And yet we've now had almost 60. So I think we'll end the year with about 60 in terms of the evolution debate challenge series. And what we'll do is come together and we'll have a show titled something like, reflecting on the 2022 evolution debate challenge series. And we'll just have a couple hour discussion. Kent will be here. We'll go over, we did this midway through the year as well. It was me, Kent, and Matt. And we just discussed the debates up to that point. And then we should wrap up the year with something like that as well. So anyways, last thing I want to say, guys, just a reminder, end times revealed, special creation, and endogenous retroviruses. So you can pick those up at any time. And I talked to my website designer today, actually. So look at the website sometime in the next few days, and the website will be completely revamped, more content on it, so on and so forth. So great point, Stacy. Anybody just tuning in, I'm going to wrap it up here. Okay. But that was 2.5 hours roughly. And if you love the topic of polystrate trees, please check this out. Share this around. The truth is important. And we made sure this was comprehensive for you guys, ensuring that we refuted all of the top skeptic arguments on this topic. So again, guys, thank you so much for the super chats, the support. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for always being so engaged in this important topic. And until we meet again this Saturday, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.